Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be conducting another case study analysis for a student who is a rising senior applying in fall 2025. So this student is a listener of the episode. We're going to use the pseudonym Rosemary here to refer to her. So I'll just paint a brief overview of what we're going to discuss. So we're going to go through her high school context. We're going to then dive into her candidacy, her grades, her course rigor, her test scores, her recommendation letters. We're then going to overview her resume, her different awards, activities. Then we're going to conduct a hook analysis, basically to determine what we think her hook should be in her overall strategic positioning for the applications. We're then going to come back. I'm going to talk through how I would package her resume, her awards, her activities, and the additional information section for the common application. And then we're going to leave off with a school and early decision analysis. That was one of the points that she and her dad requested, was to sort of analyze her candidacy, particularly with respect to putting in early decision commitments and where she's sort of viable and what the best strategy would be there. So to kick things off, Rosemary attends a small private high school. So this is a nice juxtaposition against our previous episode. So I've mentioned that when you look at sort of categories of schools, so if you look at a small private school versus a very large public high school, as we saw in the last episode, you will see a lot of structural similarities between large public schools and small private schools within their own categories. So the student attends a small private school, 334 students in total across grades 9 through 12 in the most recent school profile. This private high school is ranked roughly around the top 100, around 5,000 plus private high schools that are ranked. So in terms of high school rankings, this is a very nice and sort of quick and dirty way of getting a sense of a student's high school. You can look at US News rankings, or Niche's website that also has high school rankings. And so I'm using the Niche rankings, which I tend to do very often, particularly for private schools. So it's about a top 100 private high school across the country out of 5,000 plus ranked private schools. 100% of the students are accepted to four-year colleges. So remember from the last episode, the number was quite a bit lower at that high school. So that was maybe, I forget what it was, but maybe it was 38%, 50%, something along those lines. So pretty much every single student from this high school goes on to attend a four-year college. There is no AP curriculum at the school. Again, very structurally common for a lot of small private high schools across the United States. Of course, there are going to be some private schools that do have APs. Some of them sort of have a hybrid where they have some APs in some subjects, but they might not have them for English or history. It sort of depends, but a lot of private schools tend to have different curricula, sort of somewhat non-traditional, non-AP curricula. So this is quite common. Instead, the school offers an alternative set of advanced classes that they quote unquote say are equal to or beyond AP level and are multidisciplinary, experiential, and project-based. This is sort of a quote here that you could apply to a ton of different private high schools. This type of curriculum, it's experiential, it's project-based, seminar-based, and there's no AP curriculum. So very, very similar, very par for the course for a lot of private high schools across the United States. Also very similar for a lot of private high schools. This school does not rank its students. And again, this is in contrast to the previous episode that we did, large public high school. Many large public high schools do rank their students. It's a diminishing number over time, but the vast majority of private high schools, you will not see any class ranking. Something that is not as common for many private high schools, this high school does not give any specific grades for ninth grade outside of credit designation. So if a student gets a C or better in any ninth grade class, they simply receive the designation credit on their transcript. Not having any grades in ninth grade, you most often see this in California, but not at a lot of other high schools, are not nearly as many across the rest of the country outside of California. So that is a little bit noteworthy. And there are various courses. This is, again, also pretty common for a lot of private high schools. There are various courses that are required for all students across different grades. I believe in this student's case, one of their global studies classes was required. There might be an English, a history. In the student's case, there's an English and history combined class that is required. So again, that's pretty common for a lot of private schools. Very often they have, for example, just a very standardized English or history curriculum where all the students take English 9, 10, 11, 12. There's no AP Lang, there's no AP Lit. There might be some other electives, particularly in senior year, but this is, again, quite common for a private high school. Okay, diving to the students' grades and courses. So in ninth grade, we don't have any grades, of course. We just have that she received all credit for each of her classes. Some notes here from ninth grade in terms of foreign language. She took French 2 and 3. So she doubled up there in terms of French levels. For math, she took geometry. And for science, she took 2 science classes, conceptual physics and environmental lab science. For 10th grade, across her core classes, so this doesn't include classes, such as art, for example, that's not a core class. It shouldn't be factored into the GPA. If the high school factors into the GPA, this high school does not factor a cumulative GPA. But if a high school does factor cumulative GPA and they do include, non-core classes such as PE or art or anything else that's not really a core class, a lot of times the colleges are just going to take that out. They're not going to consider that. So in terms of her core classes, she had 1 A+ in 10th grade, 4 A's, and 1 A-. So this is quite typical across pretty much all of her grades. She's mostly right in the central thrust there of a flat A, and then she'll have occasionally, an A+ or 2, and then an A- or 2. Or she has 1 A- in each of 10th and 11th grade. So 2 A- is total on her transcript. So in terms of her 10th grade classes, some of the noteworthy classes here. For foreign language, she took advanced topics in French. Then she doubled up and took Spanish 2, and the student also noted that she self-studied over the summer going to 10th grade in order to be able to jump into Spanish 2 in 10th grade. In terms of math, she took Algebra 2, and then in terms of science, she doubled up similar to foreign language and took biology and chemistry. So in terms of the math progression here, this is a pretty typical progression. I would sort of just say this is table stakes course rigor for a student who's applying to top 20 colleges, which is she's basically on a track to hit Calc 1, sort of slash Calc AB equivalents by senior year. We do see a lot of students, and I've certainly covered some of them who are, particularly in the last episode, students who are quite a bit more advanced in math. They might be taking, pre-calc by 10th grade. In some cases, for students who are particularly advanced, they might even be in pre-calc by 9th grade. Of course, as we covered in the last episode, where that was also more of a social sciences and humanities student, this is also a social sciences and humanities student. So it's not going to matter as much that the STEM rigor might be a little bit lower. And her high school, as many private high schools do, it does have a lot of very advanced calc options. It has multivariate. It has linear algebra. There are certainly going to be, students at the high school who are quite advanced. She's not particularly super advanced on the math curriculum, but again, because it's not as relevant to her positioning, it's not as big of an issue. Generally, I would strongly encourage the vast majority of students, unless they are at significant risk of getting a B in the class, and math is a real weakness for them, then you obviously have to balance the course rigor versus the grades. Many students who are applying to top 20 colleges should ideally be trying to get to Calc BC level, ideally, but it's going to be not as much of an issue for students who are in social sciences or humanities. But again, as I mentioned last episode, in terms of the academics, the academic index, many colleges, regardless of the student's positioning, they still want to see a pretty well-rounded amount of course rigor and a pretty well-rounded academic index. When it comes to the resume, that could be a lot more specific to your field. You do want to be pretty well-rounded, and so don't totally overlook either the math, the STEM side, or the English, the humanities and social sciences, even if you are on the opposite side in terms of your positioning. Even if you're a STEM kid, you don't want to just be totally passing on thinking that you're going to get a free pass on taking AP Lang or AP Lit, and the converse is true as well. Again, for 10th grade, she took advanced topics in French, Spanish 2 doubled up there, skipped into Spanish 2 with the self-studying, math, algebra 2, and then the science was bio and chem doubled up on science there. So that's good also from a STEM perspective. The math is less impressive there to some extent, but again, she's getting to sort of Calc AB, Calc 1 level, so it's not the worst in the world. 11th grade, her core classes, she had 2 A+, 4 A's, 1 A-. And she took 4 advanced slash college level courses at her school. So there is a specific designation or acronym at this high school that they have for their sort of, AP equivalent or post AP equivalent classes, but I'm not going to use their designation just because I don't want to potentially give away the student's high school. So she took 4 advanced or college level courses. One of them was required, which was global studies, which, as we'll see, is sort of relevant to her narrative. That was a required advanced college level course for all 11th graders at her high school. In terms of languages, foreign languages, again, she took advanced slash college French, the advanced offering at her school, and took Spanish 3. So again, doubling up there on the foreign language. For math, she took pre-calc. And then for science, she took advanced or college level psychology. So the biggest issue so far is the science selection. I did mention this in the prior episode, in the prior case study, that students really ideally, and I would say regardless of what they're positioning for, even if they are more of a social sciences or humanities student, you really ideally want to have 2 APs or whatever the equivalent is at your high school, advanced college level. You really want to have 2 out of the 3 core sciences. So if it's an AP curriculum, you want to have out of AP Physics, AP Bio, and AP Chem, you want to have taken at least 2 of those before you graduate if you are applying and want to be competitive for top 20 colleges. So I don't like the science selection in 11th grade because psych is not considered. Now, her high school and the course catalog, and this will be the case at some high schools, it really depends how they label psychology. At her high school, they label it a science. But regardless of what at a local level, your high school, how they label things, that doesn't mean that the college is going to necessarily agree or that they're going to see things the same way. And I've also mentioned that, APES, AP Environmental Science, that's always going to be in the science department, every single high school. But that is not considered a core bread and butter rigorous science APES. So similar with AP Psychology, it's fine if you're doubling up, right? It could be, you're doubling up if it's labeled as a social science. You could be taking 2 social sciences, or if your school considers it a science, you're taking that as an extra and doubling up there. But it's not ideal as a standalone science selection. And again, we saw this with the prior episode that we did. And with that student, she also was only on track to take AP Physics and was not going to have AP Bio or AP Chem by the time she graduated. And it's just not ideal. You want to at least have 2. In an ideal world, if you're more advanced or it can be facilitated through your high school, it would be obviously ideal to have all 3 of that trinity of AP, core AP sciences, but 2 is going to be most common, and I would say generally that should be what you're aiming for. You should generally not be trying to swap in APES or AP Psych or whatever the equivalent is for, something like AP Bio, AP Chem, or AP Physics. So I don't love that. Again, she's not an engineering student where this would cause, much bigger issues. She's not a student, positioning for biomedical fields or something where that would really raise a red flag. So she does get a little bit more of a pass, but you do have to understand that there are pretty similar expectations, not exactly the same, but pretty similar expectations for many students for the core classes and what you take in terms of your academic index, regardless of what your positioning is, right? But she'll get a little bit of a slight pass here just because it's not going to be as harmful to her candidacy because she's not a traditional STEM student. For 12th grade, she is signed up to take, I believe, so every single class is an advanced or college level class at the student's high school. So I believe it's 7 in total. For math, she's going to be taking the advanced college Calc 1. She's then going to be taking an advanced college level English class, an advanced college level race and identity class for history, and that will be relevant to her narrative. She's going to be taking an advanced college level class in French, another one after 11th grade, plus Spanish 4. For science, she's going to be taking advanced college level bio, which of course I'm happy that she's getting one of these core sciences in here. I just wish that she had another one, either chem or physics. And then in terms of some other classes or electives, she's taking an advanced college level capstone class, and then she is taking an advanced college level professional experience class, which is a requirement at her high school. And this is going to be related to public health specifically, and we'll talk about the project that she's going to be doing in a little bit. All in all, if we're sort of assessing her course rigor, so her grades, pretty much she's generally a flat A student. On the bookend, she'll have an A plus here or there and an A minus here or there, but generally is an A student. And then in terms of course rigor through 12th grade through senior year, this is very asymmetric. A lot of the advanced or college level courses are going to be occurring in 12th grade. And this is due to, and I've mentioned this in some other episodes, this is what happens when you have high schools, particularly private schools, but they can be public schools in some cases that are more restrictive in terms of allowing students to take AP or advanced or college level courses. So at her high school, you can't take any advanced or college level courses until you get to 11th grade. And so in terms of what the college sees from, sort of evaluating her in terms of more rigorous coursework, they're really only going to see those 4 more rigorous classes from 11th grade. She does have that advanced topics from 10th grade, but this is, common for schools that are more restrictive in terms of their curricula and what they allow in terms of advanced offerings. And it's not the most ideal because out of the 11 advanced, college level courses that she has at her high school, 7 of them basically are occurring in senior year, and the college basically has no grades for them, right? So it's great on paper that you're in those classes, right? And on paper, you can add it to your course rigor, but actually haven't seen how you've done in those classes yet, right? So it's, of course, much more ideal. And the student that we saw in the prior episode who was taking a couple of APs by 9th grade and then taking 3 or 4 by 10th grade and then taking 5 in 11th grade and then 5 in 12th grade. They just have a much more steady and even track record in advanced classes all throughout their high school career, and a lot more for the college to evaluate by the time you're applying, specifically if you are applying early. So at best, the colleges will be able to evaluate her after the first marking period. I believe she's on a trimester system. For a school that's on a trimester system, they'll be sending those grades typically a little bit late, but some of those schools, they know that there are colleges that require the early grades, and so they might, in some cases for the seniors, they might end the trimester a little bit early, or you often will get those trimester grades. They usually have to try to figure something out. If a student's high school has a semester system, they might send a sort of like a progress report if a college requires first marking period grades in senior year for students who are applying early. But in the best case, they would have, just a first marking period, a first trimester, a set of grades, but not most of the year in senior year for those more rigorous courses. So in total, as I mentioned, she'll have 11 advanced college level courses. 2 of them were required, and 2 of them are the capstone and the professional experience. The professional experience is going to be considered, colleges are not going to take that seriously, regardless of how the high school designates that. Same thing for the capstone, pretty similar. You could say this is, something like AP research, but, there are APs that are not very serious APs. So I would sort of say the professional experience isn't really going to be, taken as a very serious advanced or college level course by the colleges. And the capstone sort of on the fence. I would say she's probably, net closer to probably 9 or 10 advanced or college level courses, but still pretty solid. In terms of other advanced courses, she had that other advanced topics course in French in 10th grade as well. In terms of some other notes regarding her course rigor, she did double up on languages for several years here. Since 10th grade, she's doubled up on languages. She did also double up on science a bit as well in 9th and 10th grade, though I don't, again, love the fact that she didn't have an advanced or college level chem or physics class. I didn't like that with trying to swap that for psych in 11th grade, so that wasn't the best. Her STEM side, including that I just mentioned regarding not having a more advanced STEM course out of the 3 core STEM courses. In addition, as we mentioned, she's getting through Calc 1. It's certainly fine. It's basically the minimum expected course rigor for any student applying to top 20 colleges. So it's like basically that's just table stakes. It's just getting to calculus AP. Generally, as I said before, it would almost always prefer that a student gets to Calc BC unless they are at significant risk, if they are really not a strong math student, and ideally both of these conditions would be the case if you're not getting to Calc BC, is that it's not as relevant to your positioning in your narrative, and it would also be maybe jeopardizing your GPA. If both of those are true, then a student has a more plausible reason for not taking up to Calc BC, Calc 2, or beyond. So those are a few notes there. In terms of her test scores, so her PSAT was a 1360, exactly split evenly 680 math, 680 verbal. There will be a little bit of a new recognition that's coming out of that from the College Board, but that wouldn't be a strong enough score to qualify for National Merit semifinalists. In terms of her SAT, she currently sits at a 1480, so 740 math, 740 verbal. That's quite nice that she's just very evenly split. You just don't often see that among students where they're exactly evenly split. So she is very well balanced between the math and the verbal there, 740, 740, 1480 overall. In terms of APs, she doesn't have any AP exams. So her high school doesn't have an AP curriculum. That doesn't mean that you can't still take AP exams. So this just really depends on the particular high school. In some cases, there's a spectrum here, right? So of course, if you are in AP classes, you're generally going to be taking AP exams. We know that. If you have a curriculum where it's not an AP class, but it aligns pretty well with the AP curriculum, you might just require, some extra self-studying, a month or two out from the AP exam, or some extra tutoring, etc. It's around the vicinity of an AP class, but doesn't have an AP title. There's that sort of situation. And then there's a situation whereby the class at your high school just doesn't align at all with the AP curriculum. And it would really require very significant self-studying in order to do well, which I'll define as getting at least a 4, ideally a 5 for top colleges. It would take a lot of work to be able to do so. Now, there are students who just do the self-studying. They don't have a course that is, particularly well calibrated, and they will just do a lot of self-studying, or maybe they don't even take a course at all that is in that area, and they will just completely self-study and they will take the AP exams. Then there are students, again, where their curriculum is sort of around, it's close, but it's not an AP level class in terms of how it's designated at the high school, and it's maybe not exactly aligned to the AP curriculum, but with a bit of self-studying, not too much, they could put themselves in position and sort of calibrate their curriculum to the AP exam and be prepared. So it's not that just because your school doesn't have an AP curriculum that you just absolutely don't take AP exams. It sort of is a case-by-case evaluation depending on the student's high school and their particular situation, their goals, how much studying would potentially be required. I don't want to sort of say that it's just, we don't have an AP curriculum at the student's high school, so therefore nobody at the student's high school or nobody would ever be taking AP exams. It's not true. There are a lot of students who go to private high schools, they don't have an AP curriculum, and they still take AP exams. It's something that is very case specific, but in this student's case, she did not take any AP exams. For recommendation letters, her first recommendation letter is from her French teacher, who has taught her in 10th and 11th grade. So I've mentioned some of the conventions for recommendation letters throughout various episodes, and also in the last episode case study that we did for another rising senior. The conventions are: A, you want to have a 11th grade teacher, ideally. Now, if they taught you in 10th grade or 9th grade and in 12th grade, any of those on top of teaching in 11th grade, you get bonus points from that. But you don't really want to have a 9th or 10th grade teacher or 12th grade teacher who hasn't taught you for most of the year yet. You want to have an 11th grade teacher who's taught you in at least 11th grade, and then it could be other grades as well as a bonus. So she does have 2 teachers who've taught her an 11th grade course. Her French and her psych teacher is going to be the second one. So that checks off in terms of meeting the usual. These are conventions, and they're not absolute requirements, but they are conventions. And as such, if you break these conventions, you need to have a good reason for doing so. So So she's meeting that convention of teaching her in 11th grade. Second convention, one should be a social sciences or humanities teacher, and the other one should be a STEM teacher. So she does have the French, which is sort of social sciences. The French is a language, so it's humanity. And then psych, depending again how you consider psych, this isn't the most traditional STEM course, as I've mentioned before, so I don't absolutely love it. But what will always reign supreme in terms of your recommendation letters is the overall quality of the letters. The overall quality is definitely the most important factor that trumps the other factors. And I've mentioned on the prior episode, there might be a certain number of points that you would be willing to give in terms of the quality of a letter to meet the conventions, but it's not a lot. You wouldn't want to, in order to meet all of the conventions, you wouldn't want to be adding a 4 out of 10 recommendation letter to your file. That would not make sense, right? You could say, oh, I've met all the conventions. They're 11th grade teachers, one social science humanities, one STEM, and one of them's, to meet those conventions, I did my calculus teacher and they're going to write me a terrible letter of recommendation. That's not it's not worth it in that case, right? But ideally, you want to be meeting conventions and have good letters at the same time. And colleges will note this. If you didn't submit they'll use the jargon a solid. A solid sort of means like a core class. If you did, for example, science research as one of your letters, they'll put something like not a solid or something like that, right, in their feedback. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get into the college, but it is an acknowledgement, a sort of a citation that you are breaking convention. So in terms of that second convention, having a social science humanities teacher, then a STEM teacher, the psych is like a very watered down STEM teacher. She's a little bit more plausible deniability here because her high school does consider psych to be a science class. It's not the most ideal in the world, but you always best off choosing the teachers who are going to write you the best letters. So that is a second convention, is that we have the social science humanities and then the STEM balance. We mentioned that we want to also have, a 11th grade teacher. You want to have two of them, even though all colleges don't require two or read two. You also want to ideally have one that's relevant to your field. The French is quite relevant to some of her narrative here, so that is also ideal. And in terms of the content of the letters, you want them to ideally be referencing anecdotes or projects that are relevant to your hook. So she does kind of have that here as well, so that's good. And then one of the other conventions that I didn't mention, that I mentioned before, is just you want these to be core classes. I kind of alluded to this a little bit before with the science research. That's not a core class. The core classes are your core science class, not a research elective. And then you have history, foreign language, you have math, you have English, right? So you have 5 core classes that you want your teacher X to come from. Again, this psych is a little bit suspect on that front as a sort of core science class, whether it's social science, social studies department, or it's a science. It's still generally under the 5 core classes. It's more of whether it's a solid STEM letter, but it's not the biggest issue in the world. For a French teacher, so they taught her in French 4 and then also advanced college level of French in 11th grade. She estimates that the rating will be a 10 out of 10, so that's great. It's also relevant to some of her positioning. The psych teacher from 11th grade estimated the rating will be an 8 out of 10. And what I would do here is I looked at I think the student actually sent along some of the synopsis for the psychology class. So this student's going to have some positioning that's going to be related to sort of international relations, but then also, diversity, ethnicity studies, some of those themes. And in the psychology course description, it did talk about, the sort of the psychology of race, diversity, language, etc. So to the extent that this student had any projects in the psychology class that related to race, diversity, or some of those themes that will be relevant to her positioning, you want to make sure to remind that teacher to put that into the letter because it's those anecdotes are relevant to your overall hook and your overall positioning, right? And so again, as we've seen through various case studies, you want to really be bending the application to constantly be conforming to what the hook is. So I would definitely fit that in there. Also, again, as another reminder, you want to be supplying very detailed anecdotes to your teachers. Hopefully, they've given you a brag sheet or a rec questionnaire to fill out. If they haven't, then you want to still supply them various anecdotes and details, particularly that could be relevant to your hook, but anything that it would be very compelling that would show your intellectual curiosity in the class, you're going above and beyond, your collaborative nature, you're going to the office hours. You can't have a teacher just writing you a letter of recommendation that just repeats your transcript and just tells them that you're a strong student, because I don't need a letter of recommendation to do that. I can see your grade in the class, right? So there are a lot of students who, think that they're going to have great teacher recommendations, just because they do really well in the class. And that's not what makes for a really effusive, emotionally charged letter of recommendation. A lot of that is you going above and beyond, you talking, with the teacher, you having good relationship. Ideally, maybe they even supervise you in a club, right? That's what's going to add a lot of that oomph. Now, if you have some of those academic or intellectual superlatives, such as, this student is the best student I've taught in 10 years, or they were amazing, they're the only student who got all hundreds on all the quizzes, those are great as well and can certainly form part of the bedrock of the letters of recommendation. But it's really all of those anecdotes, those stories, that relationship, your relationship with the teacher, your relationship with your peers, again, going above and beyond on projects, putting in some relevant information to your hook. That's really what makes much stronger letters of recommendation. And then finally, for the student's college counselor, she says that she's known her or him for 2 years, and they are the club advisor for the student of the multiracial affinity club. So that's actually quite rare. I would say that is going to be extremely rare at a public high school. But since there are counselors particularly at private high schools, who sometimes are teachers or they're involved in the extracurricular community in some way, it's more likely to happen at a private high school that the student's college counselor is also going to be, supervising or potentially even, teaching a class, at the high school. So that's really great, and it's not very common to see that, but that's really great because the college counselor actually supervises the student in a club, and not just in a club, but in a club that's actually going to be relevant to the positioning. So we've mentioned before that the college counselor letter, the job of that, either college counselor or guidance counselor, a lot of private high schools will call them college counselors, and public schools are usually called guidance counselors. That counselor letter is meant mainly to convey the students their role in the larger high school community and the clubs and just at large at the high school. It's not meant to talk very specifically about inside the classroom performance in the way that a teacher recommendation would. Again, they can contextualize a student's academic performance, or how hard was their course rigor compared to what most students do. They can talk about some of those academic contextual factors, if there's any, anomalous grades or other circumstances that would go in a counselor letter as well. But the first and foremost sort of talking point or aspect of a counselor letter is going to be the student's role in their high school community. And since this counselor supervises the student, not only in a club, but in a particularly relevant club, it's going to be a lot easier for them to do that and speak directly from experience than most college or guidance counselors would be able to do. Now, we're going to get into the student's resume, so their awards and their activities. I'm going to just go through. So I've already actually reordered the student's resume, what they sent, and I've put it in the way that I think it should go in the common application and the way that I think it should be ordered to reflect the hook. But first, what I want to do is I want to just overview so everybody has a sense of what the student's profile looks like. I'm just going to read through these a bit quickly. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. Then once we have the full picture of the student, we're going to do the hook analysis and sort of say, okay, what should the overall positioning for the application be? And then we're going to come back because we have to have done that hook analysis to then say, okay, well, now how should we package all of these activities and these awards in the actual application itself, given what we believe to be the student's strongest positioning in terms of their hook, having identified it. So I'm going to read through these quickly here. So the student has a NISLE semifinalist for the Indonesia program. So that's the National Security Language Initiative for Youth. Indonesia semifinalist. She was a diversity conference representative, one of 8 chosen from her school to go to a diversity conference in Colorado. She won a language award from the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages in 11th grade. And then she received a College Board School Recognition Award. So this program, this award is new. It was just unveiled in 2025. And I believe the cutoff for this is the top 10% of PSAT scores at your high school, I believe is what the cutoff is. It's a brand new award, and this isn't national merit. And recently what happened with some of these recognition awards is the College Board actually did away with any that have to do, and this is going to be a little bit interesting given that the student's positioning is diversity related. They actually did away with any sort of ethnicity related awards such as the Hispanic recognition program. They did away with that, and they've sort of revamped a bit of their recognition awards, the College Board, which again, these are different from national merit. So she does have that College Board School Recognition Awards. I believe it's top 10% PSAT scores from your particular high school. In terms of activities, she has a research project with a professor who's writing a book. And this is a sociology professor, which is going to be, I don't want to give it away too much, but I think this is going to end up being her first and foremost positioning. So it is not coincidental, but I think this person is in sociology. And this is on the oral history. So she's helping them write a book and doing research. And we'll go into some of the bullet points later on, but she's helping them with a book on the oral history of LGBTQ teachers' experiences from the 1970s to the present. She then is a co-president of the Multiracial Affinity Club, and she has some bullets here, organizing events, etc. I believe this is going on right now. She's part of the Youth Ambassador Program for Algeria, and so this is a funded U.S. Department of State Youth Ambassador program. She put a note here. It's now included with the Iraqi program and rebranded as the Youth Ambassador Middle East and North Africa program. She's on the Youth Advisory Council. This is not at her high school. This seems like this is sort of a local government organization, sort of a collaboration between the community, local government, and students. I believe this is probably where she lives. And then she wrote for the school newspaper, and it looks like she's now an editor from 10th grade through 12th grade. And then finally, in terms of her activities, she was a full-time employee at McDonald's in summer 2024. And in terms of, there's one more note here, though I don't think this is something we can really put in the activities or the honors sections of the common application, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. She is on track to get a certificate in global studies at her high school. So we've seen that she has some of these diversity themes, and then she also was doubling up on the languages, and she was taking the global studies, class at 11th grade that was required. So their certificate program, there are all these different special programs. It's both private schools, public schools. Science research is a big sort of, special program. A lot of schools will call them like a signature program or something like that. And they have one typically for, something like global studies or something that's more social science, humanities. Then they'll have science research. So again, I've mentioned this before. I think it's a false dichotomy. Science does not mean just purely laboratory-based experimental science. A lot of people sort of confuse it with specific subject areas. Science is a method or a mode of inquiry. It's not it's not that somebody who's in sociology isn't performing science. A little bit of a false dichotomy, but the way that the typical vernacular as most people understand it, there'll be a science research program, might be, a quote unquote signature program or some program at a high school. Some schools now have entrepreneurship programs or business related programs. So at her high school, there is a certificate in global studies. In order to receive the certificate, students have to have sequential study of one language for all the years at high school. They have to participate in at least 2 global seminars. They have to complete an advanced or college level course in global studies. They have to complete an advanced college level course in global intensive with international travel. They have to take 2 globally focused courses, complete a co-curricular project, and they have to complete a capstone. And in her case, her capstone, she says, will most likely focus on the difference in mental health perceptions and care in developed versus developing countries, which is a very interesting project. She does have that. She's on track for that certificate, but it's a little bit tenuous because there are requirements or prerequisites for that certificate that she has not yet completed, right? Such as the capstone project. So it's hard to really put in the actual honor section, and it's not really an activity, so we'll talk about where this could go. You could probably guess there's not a lot more space for this in the common application. We will want to fit it in because it does help to reinforce some of her hooks, but she does have that. She's on track to get their certificate in global studies, which would be relevant to her positioning. That's a sense of her sort of awards and her activities. In terms of the strength of these activities and these awards, it's pretty solid. The NISLI program, the Indonesia semi-finalist, is pretty noteworthy. She didn't ultimately, end up getting it. She was a semi-finalist, but it's reasonably well known. It's going to be relevant to her positioning. The diversity conference representative, I've kind of packaged that as an award and also going to package it as an activity. I think it sort of has an activity component, but also has an award or a selection component to it. So I'm actually going to stretch it and make it an activity and award. That's certainly fine. It's maybe like a lower in value designation. She has this sort of foreign languages award. That's just kind of like technically a regional award to some extent. It's a school/regional award. It's right on the fence because the organization that's awarding it is a regional organization, but it's being given usually either one student at the school or maybe multiple students at the school for foreign language. So it's sort of a school/regional. That's a pretty common type of award. You sort of see these social studies awards, math awards, the different high schools give out. So it's nothing major. I would say she has probably about 3 mid-level-ish awards, but nothing absolutely outstanding. The good thing, however, is these awards are actually relevant to her positioning. So that is nice compared to a student who has awards that are not as relevant to their hook and their positioning. I will say throughout her activities as well, she does have a lot of activities that it's not very hard to tie them together. Now, they're not all as neatly sort of woven together as you might like, but they are in sort of all the same vicinity. And we'll talk about what sort of hook should come out of these activities. She does have a lot of very relevant activities that are relevant, to each other. In terms of that sociology professor book that she's helping with, that's great. It's another way that you could do a research project, right? We don't have to think so rigidly, in terms of doing cancer research, as I've mentioned before. This professor isn't at the most prestigious college in the world, so that's totally fine. If you can get some really cool, interesting project, it's obviously relevant to her interest. As I mentioned a lot, it's great to have niche projects or niche research and not be the kid who's just doing some very typical biological research like all the other kids, right? So I do like this, and you don't always need to have a professor who's at a top college. And in some cases, it actually could be a liability. That sometimes there's a science research program at a high school, and a lot of the students all work with, professors, or a lot of them do research with professors at, maybe a top college that's nearby, but then everybody sort of has it on their resume. So no problem at all with her doing this with a professor who's sort of not the most brand name college in the world. It's a cool project. And as long as you have unique, interesting contributions, it's totally fine. And I'll say the same thing again when taking college courses. You don't need to take college courses if you're in high school and you're trying to beef up your course rigor or take some external college courses related to your hook. You don't need to be looking for the most name brand colleges in the world. Community colleges classes are totally fine. Or some state, if you're in New York, there's a whole bunch of SUNY schools. It doesn't really matter a ton. She also has significant leadership and sort of spearheading, different events in the multiracial affinity club, which is also going to be relevant to her positioning. She has the youth ambassador program, Algeria, or youth ambassador in Middle East and North Africa program, which is pretty selective. It's a fully funded U.S. Department of State program, so that gives it a lot of firepower and legitimacy. It's relevant to her narrative. She has, again, sort of the diversity conference, the sort of activity side of that. Then she has the advisory council, which is, we're kind of getting into parts that are not as directly relevant to the hook, but she is going to be the incoming co-president, so she does have leadership. We can make that relevant to the narrative, even though it's not the most on the nose. And then she is an editor of the newspaper for multiple years. Again, it's not the most relevant, but we'll try to dig some relevance out of it. And then this the McDonald's is really, really interesting, right? I don't know what the listener or the audience would sort of think about what I would say about this, given that I'm generally not a huge advocate for sports or generally irrelevant activities. Activities are not going to be as relevant to the student's hook. Not a huge fan in general of jobs from a college strategic perspective, like like very typical jobs, being a camp counselor or a lifeguard at the country club. These are very common teenage jobs. But if the job is actually potentially relevant to the student's narrative or there's an interesting story there, I'm actually quite in favor of it. It's probably not something that we would ordinarily set out to do if we were, planning things from scratch. But, have had students who are interested in business, and they can maybe have a more elevated role, in a store that they've had a job at over the summer. And so if the job is relevant to the narrative or there's a really interesting story potentially, and she kind of has that here. Now, I think the student's main positioning is going to be, in the realm of sociology, and if there's anything she could speak to, if there's any having coworkers from different cultural backgrounds or different socioeconomic backgrounds or even customers at McDonald's, anything like that, that she can include in her application, either the essays or the bullet points of this actual activity. It would be very interesting. It'd be and potentially a very cool story, but if it could be relevant, that's even better. So I like that part, if we can anyway make this relevant. The second part that I really like, right, so I talk a lot about perception of privilege. There are a lot of private high schools, the student school included. I believe the tuition for the school, if you are boarding at the school, is I believe $75,000 a year. If you're a full paying student, that's going to be more than the salary of most people who are reading the student's application, right? So there is that constant being aware of your privilege and, you know, not coming off as just another private school student. Now, I know a lot of private school students are very aware of this. They, in some cases, then just go on to do very common activities to sort of try to counter this. So they do their service trips to Guatemala, right? And we're going to do, my high school, we're all going to take all of the kids to go to Thailand, right? To help the poor people. And there's this very, like, kind of yucky potential virtue signaling. I use the term, which is actually comes from sociology, as we're talking about a sociology student. Conspicuous consumption was the original term, but there's sort of an offshoot of it, which is called conspicuous compassion. It basically is virtue signaling. And so a lot of students sort of do this, they go down to the Bronx to help, kids from the Bronx play squash as if, the kids from the Bronx just, they nothing better to do than they want to play squash. There's like a lot of this, this virtue signaling that I think is potentially the wrong way of going about trying to offset the sort of perception of privilege. This is actually a really cool, I'll call this a counter signal, right? And so counter signaling is, it's a statement against yourself. It's sort of a statement of humility. So if you go back to one of the prior episodes, I did the rejected pre-med case study. He did counter signaling the wrong way, which he actually made himself sound less impressive. So he talked about like struggling with research, or he said things that just actually didn't make him sound like a promising scholar. That's counter signaling gone wrong, right? You do want to be conveying yourself as being a promising intellectual scholar. Another example of counter signaling gone right was a student that we had who was talking about a business that she started. And in the beginning of the essay, she was talking about how she would always ramble on and like nobody could get her to shut up. And, she would be talking to a waiter in Mexico and trying to be speaking to them in Spanish. And she just would never shut up. And then we sort of turned it into, how when she started running her business, she had to learn to listen to others and sort of shut up and listen to the feedback that she was getting about her business. And so that was counter signaling done right, right? It was sort of this funny way of sort of making fun of yourself and sort of taking a shot at yourself, but it didn't compromise any of her intellectual promise because then we went in and we overcame it with her starting this amazing business and showing all of her business acumen and tying in that sort of going from a talker to a listener. Now, counter signaling, I'm not really using it in that sort of sense here, but it is this work in the McDonald's is sort of a counter signal to the student's academic context, which can come off certainly as privileged. If the student can sort of think creatively about this or come up with some creative anecdotes or some intersections with diversity or race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic class, etc., from this experience, it's not only just really likable, right? And likability is huge in admissions. Likability is one of your biggest assets. A lot of students just don't come across as that likable, right? It's not easy to like write and self-brand, right? You're walking this very difficult tightrope of you have to basically make them think that you're super impressive and you're intellectual and you're a promising scholar who will contribute in this specific field or in this specific way to the college and the world beyond. But at the same time, you can't come across as a braggart, right? Or be lacking in humility or compromise your likability or sound egotistical. So it's a very hard tightrope to walk. And you're talking about yourself, and you also have the paradox of you have to make yourself sound good, but there's also this paradox, this contradiction whereby we take what people say about themselves, we assign it the least amount of credibility. If somebody else says it about you, it's if Bob says John's amazing, I'm much more likely to think John's amazing than if John himself says John is amazing, right? And so this is why this process and the application process is very difficult, particularly for students who are not very good at self-branding, as many smart, very smart intellectual students are not good at self-branding. They don't even like it. They would hate the word. They don't, networking, they would say, ugh, yuck. Right. But what I really like here is the student potentially has some relevant anecdotes, but it's really likable, right? It's just a really likable work experience. It's very uncommon versus, again, all the kids from the private high school doing these very common, community service trips or Habitat for Humanity or going to Africa. It's going to be very rare. I've never seen a student who has a full-time job at McDonald's, particularly from a private high school, right? So it's rare, it's unique, it's not cliche, it's not generic, it's very likable, it's got the counter signaling in here, and she could also make it relevant. So this is sort of one of these kind of get these activities that are these like real sleeper activities that somebody might not really make that big of a deal of or think is that much. I've mentioned this before. Another podcast, one from a past student that we had, he was doing historical shipwreck diving and he was a student interested in history. That is a super cool activity. Now, it wasn't really a very formal activity in the traditional sense, but it was really great for signaling intellectual vitality and what you do when, you're not in a structured club or a structured school setting. Like, it was a part of him. His love for history was a part of who he was, right? And so that came part and parcel with the informality or the hobby aspect, but that really tells me that you really love it because you have to go really above and beyond or out of your way to do something like that, right? So of course, we made sure that we got it across in the application. It was part of the story and the jumping off point, no pun intended, for his personal essay. And then we put it in the additional information section and talked about the different, shipwrecks that he was sort of discovering. And we made sure that it was very prominent. So this is a bit of a sleeper activity here, even though I don't normally like jobs. If it's relevant and if there's potentially good stories, then then that's a different story. In terms of the hook analysis here, so the student has obviously pretty strong grades here, pretty strong course rigor. In terms of the courses, she does have a lot that is relevant to the languages, the global studies certificate. She has this race and identity class. The hook is mostly going to predominantly come from the resume, as I've mentioned very often. The hook obviously should find some relevance in terms of, again, if you're positioning for STEM or engineering, you should be taking advanced level physics, calculus. You should be doing well in those classes. If you're an English major, of course, you should be taking AP Lang or Lit or whatever the equivalent is offered by your high school. You should be doing very well in those classes, have strong verbal scores. So as I mentioned before, the academic index and the metrics, the numbers of the application, courses that you choose, your grades, your test scores are certainly relevant to the hook and they do inform the hook. But mostly what informs the hook, given that it is a passion, essentially, is what you do outside of the classroom and outside of the test day. So it's mostly going to be informed by your resume, your awards, and your activities. And so for awards, she has some of these that I think are more sort of IR, more international relations. She put an interest potentially in global studies. None of her top schools have a global studies major. They're more international relations, international affairs, international public affairs, whatever, however they label it. She does have those international themes. She has, again, the NISLI program, the National Security Language Initiative for Youth, Indonesia. She has the foreign languages. She has the Youth Ambassador Program, Algeria. She has the Certificate in Global Studies. So she does have some of these global, more IR, international affairs sort of related themes. However, she also has some of these themes that are more diversity related, right? So she has the diversity conference representative. At least I'm labeling it as an award. The selection, at least, is an award. She has this research project with the sociology professor where she's helping them write the book on the LGBTQ teachers' experiences. Right, so she has that. She has the multiracial affinity club. She has some of these other themes we also have in her capstone project. She says we'll focus on the difference in mental health perceptions and care in developed versus developing countries. Now, you could say that's more of the global studies or more of the international theme. It's got that aspect of it, but I would say if you were to say what field is that most directly in, it's either public health or sociology, right? And between the two, sociology is going to be the narrative that I believe, and I've used this term before, that subsumes the greatest amount of variance in her resume, right? So if I look at her resume and I say, okay, would this be related to sociology? Now, some of it might be a little bit broader, right? It's like certainly a bit of a stretch. We could basically get almost everything into the sociology umbrella. So even the more global or international affairs, they still have a sociology, aspect to them, right? There are other cultures, other social systems. So even her NISLI, Indonesia, that fits under sociology, even though it's more specifically or more properly, maybe the more international relations, affairs, global studies, it still fits under more broadly as well. You could still connect it to a sociology narrative. The diversity conference, that is right in the wheelhouse of sociology. The foreign languages, not as much, but you could sort of say foreign peoples. It's a little bit weaker, but it's still broadly under the umbrella. Her research project on the LGBTQ plus, the teachers, that is definitely sociology and right up the alley of sociology. The multiracial affinity club, right up the alley of sociology. You're talking about race, intersectionality, challenges of being multiracial. That's right in the wheelhouse, right on the nose sociology. Her youth ambassador program for Algeria, the Middle East. Again, it's a little bit more the global, the international affairs relations side of things, but you're talking about people from different cultures, cultural appreciation, civic participation. You're talking about NGO. Like, this is very much under the umbrella of sociology as well, even though it's a little bit more specific of a subdomain. You have the Youth Advisory Council. She put here its purpose is to raise awareness and propose solutions to issues relevant to the teenage population. Anti-vaping, suicide, drinking, these are societal problems. That also falls under the sociology umbrella and would not fall under at all the global or the international global studies, international affairs narrative. It doesn't fit there at all. She has the newspaper editor, writer. So we had to see if there was some relevant content we could pull out of that. Like, what was she writing about? I'm sure she was probably writing about some things that are relevant to some of these hooks. So not on its surface, it's not particularly relevant. That would just be more, English writing, etc. But I'm sure we could pull some relevance out of it. And then with the McDonald's, if she could talk about some, social systems or, anything, again, diversity, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, any experiences, anything there, she could also calibrate it quite easily to a sociology theme. Again, keep in mind she's working with a sociology professor. And I don't think this is coincidental, right? And so this student, if you sort of look at her profile, it's like, what is she like, right? Or it's like, how do we sort of, what is she like? What is she passionate about? Well, she seems passionate about diversity, right? The multiracial affinity club, the diversity conference. So it seems like the aspect of race, ethnicity, this intersectionality, this being multiple races, that seems to be important to her. It seems she's also interested in LGBTQ. So we're getting into diversity from a gender or sexuality perspective, right? So she's interested in that as well. She's interested in language, foreign cultures, other countries, other cultures, global studies, right? And so if you just made your hook one of these aspects, if you just made it sort of the global angle, well then it doesn't encompass, for example, a research project on the LGBTQ plus teachers, right? It would sort of not fit that into the narrative if you went the international relations route or sort of the global studies route. It would sort of, well, then how does that make sense or how does that fit in? And that's one of her higher value activities. Again, you want to be choosing the filter or the narrative that subsumes your resume and doesn't leave things out just hanging by themselves fractured, right? You don't want to, again, as I mentioned in the prior episode, you don't want to create a fractured presentation of yourself. You want to try to find these through lines. And I think it's not only important for the application, but it's also just important for life, right? I have this activity or this hobby, and then I like this other thing. You have to really think carefully, what are the nexus points? What are the through lines of your interests? Because if you really think about it, there's often very common threads between things that seem very disparate or different on their surface that you can make sense of, right? And so I think this is a very worthwhile exercise to be doing this, from a college admissions perspective that we're talking about, but it's very useful, I think, for just the student's own development and maturity and life and to be auditing, what they are really passionate about or good at. The sociology umbrella will be able to fit all of this in, right? You will be able to fit in the race, the ethnicity, the differences in, gender, sexuality, the differences in terms of different cultures or different countries. We'll be able to fit everything basically under that umbrella. And you do ideally want your first choice major, your overall main hook. You do want it to encapsulate as close as you can to your entire resume, as much as you possibly can. Now, that being said, we'll be able to get in the sort of international affairs, international relations theme as well, but we'll put that as more secondary positioning, right? I think sociology is the one that better connects or subsumes everything in her resume, and I think it makes more sense out of all of her interests. Because again, if we just do something like international relations, what does that have to do with one of her most important activities, which is her helping the sociology professor on this book that he's writing on the LGBTQ plus, right? Doesn't really have anything to do with international affairs, right? Same thing with, the multiracial affinity. Maybe it has some proximity to those themes, but the race, the multiracial component, the intersectionality, it's not really international relations, right? Sociology, I think, is her winner. When I actually devised or came up with that as being her number one, which she didn't actually put herself, international affairs, then French and global studies is what she identified. But when I actually came up with this, I actually had not seen, I probably maybe very quickly saw it in passing that the professor she was working with on that book was a sociology professor. I actually didn't even see that. But we now see how it fits a lot better and how it makes a lot of sense thinking about it in this way. She identified in terms of her sort of what she self-identified in terms of majors of interest. She put, as I said, international affairs, French, and global studies. The problem with global studies, again, it doesn't encompass everything in the resume or her awards, just like international affairs. So it has that weakness. Also, her top three colleges don't have global studies majors. So that one's sort of X'd off. International affairs relations, totally fine. It's just going to be secondary to sociology. And then French, the issue with French is she doesn't have it at all in any of her activities she has it a little bit in her awards. I don't know if that language award was specifically for French or if it was for a combination of the French and taking Spanish. But she just has one minor school award that would be relevant to it. She doesn't have, like, she's not the president of the French club. There's no real relevant activities in the resume that could support the French positioning. So all she would really have to fall back on for the French is just her main academic classes, which is it's just not ideal for a hook or for a major selection. You really should have more aspects of your resume that are supporting the hook than just your classes in school, right? And again, it's because what does the hook fundamentally mean? It is meant to convey a passion, and a passion is not as strong. It's not that it's non-existent, but it's not as strong or easy for me to see
just from the classroom when you're inside of a box and you're being graded and you have teachers hovering over you and you have multiple choice. That's not really passion, right? It's like passion is something that, you take outside of the classroom, you want to do, you love it, you're reading about it, you're taking out books at the library. Now her self-studying, you could say with the Spanish definitely does show some strong intellectual vitality outside of the classroom as well, but it's again still very adjacent to just being inside of the classroom. She's not a very strong angle to take. Sort of a French, and then even weaker would be, sort of a Spanish or something related to that. I just don't think the language positioning is nearly as strong, and I think you could say that it's a bit redundant anyway with the international positioning of the international affairs, international relations. Of course, they're different. And they're different disciplines, but they are fairly overlapping. Also, a lot of her top schools, at least two out of the three, only allow you two major selections. So we can only choose two in sociology and sort of international relations, or however it's labeled at the school. Those are going to be the two strongest. So that's how I sort of came up with her hook. Now, her three top choice schools, at least from what I saw in sort of her school feedback, were Brown. Brown allows you two majors, and so the two that I would suggest are sociology number one, international public affairs number two. There were some runner ups. So one was ethnic studies, but again, I don't think it encompasses part of a resume, but not all of it. French and Francophone studies, I talked about the weaker part of the French aspect. American studies actually is very interdisciplinary, and you do get topics like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, in particularly in the United States. You get history, so that could actually encompass a lot of her resume. But I thought American studies sounds weird and paradoxical with a lot of her global studies positioning or international interests, so I eliminated that. Anthropology, her interests aren't as much anthropology as they are sociology. So I eliminated that. And there's also gender and sexuality studies at Brown, but that would only really relate to one of her activities, which was the professor and helping them write the book. And so again, it's just not encompassing enough of her resume. So for Brown, sociology number one, international public affairs number two for the two major selections. Pomona was one of her other top choice schools. They give you two major selections, so I would do something very similar, sociology number one, and then they offer international relations. And then Tufts was also in her top three. Tufts gives you three options for majors. And so I would do sociology one, international relations two. And then Tufts has a lot of very interdisciplinary, sort of quirky niche majors or minors. So for number three, I would do either race, colonialism, and diaspora studies, or peace and justice studies, which is a minor, or social justice anthropology, which is a minor. One of those three sort of fit into a lot of the themes of her application, and so I'll let her sort of decide what she would want to pick for number three among those three options. So we have her hook, right? She's sociology number one, first and foremost. That sort of sets the stage for how we're presenting her in the entire application. So again, the hook is not just the majors, the majors that you're listing in the application. The hook is a much broader sense of what are we putting when they say, what's your career interest in that field? When we put, the activities together, the awards, what order we put them in? Do we cut any out because they're not as relevant to the narrative and they're not really that impressive, right? How do we, package the additional information section or any overflow projects, right? How do we describe the bullets in the activities, right? If you are a newspaper writer, well, she's not applying to be an English major, right? So we have to try to get some relevance out of that. The only way we can get relevance out of that is by finding what she was writing about, right? And so, what were there articles that were sociology relevant, or they were relevant to the international and public affairs or national relations angle, right? So we'll have to make the bullets there relevant, right? But you don't know what to put in these sections. You don't know what to emphasize in the bullet points or the contributions, or what to put in the additional information section. And then, most importantly, you don't even know what to put in the essays because you don't even know what you're trying to accomplish. You don't even know what your brand is. What's your strategy? Right? And so the tactics just don't make any sense if you don't have a strategy or a plan, right? And so this is always the problem with sort of just going to the essay prompts and just responding. You just have no idea what you're responding and what you're trying to accomplish in the grand scheme. So this is not only her major selections or what she's putting in the application in terms of her majors that I just went through, but it also sets the stage for everything that we construct in the application. Now, when it comes time for the essays, right? She will need to find these connections and she should go look into sociology, she seems to have somebody in her Rolodex who's a sociology professor that she happens to know, right? I would start getting much more acquainted with sociology, the frameworks in sociology, the methods, what it is, how it makes sense of her different interests and her different experiences here, right? I would start sounding, right? So like you have the toolkit of somebody who would be in that discipline. One of the most important things is that for students applying to the top colleges, they should sound like they know their field and what they're talking about, right? They should know, terms, and they should know theories, and they should sound, if you have a hook and your hook is business and you can't talk about business, or you get the Michigan Ross supplement and they ask you to solve a business related problem and you're like, I have no idea what to do here, that probably is a pretty strong signal that that's not something you have a lot of evidence to support, right? And so I sort of think of this as sort of, a dinner table discussion. If you took a kid, went out with family, friends, and there was a whole bunch of adults, friends of the parents, could they sit at the dinner table and talk about a topic related to their fields and sound like they are capable in that field and well versed and knowledgeable and sort of hold people's attention? Right? That is basically what a lot of the essay prompts are and the essay responses are measuring at the top colleges, right? It's measuring that true intellectual vitality that it sounds like you know what you're talking about, right? You have genuine experiences that relate to it, right? She could talk about her experiences in this club, or maybe tie the McDonald's, or experiences writing the book with the professor. So I'm not saying that she has to go become a sociology expert per se. There's obviously a lot of informal concepts that I'm sure she's gotten from her various related experiences. I would have her start acquainting herself with just, start with a Wikipedia, sociology, what are, who are some of the major players, what is et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of, sort of her, her ability to talk about it will come from a lot of her experiences. She's taken classes relevant and particularly more in the global aspects, the global studies. She does have a lot of academic coursework there. So I'm sure she could talk quite intelligently with some semblance of jargon and, specific concepts and terms and whatnot from some of those studies. But that's what the essays, they do need to encompass that relevant intellectual vitality and horsepower and knowledge. So we have her major selections for her top 3 colleges that I went through, her overall just hook to inform the different parts of the application and what she should be writing, in the essays. I'm just gonna go back through and just quickly mention her, sort of the ordering of the awards, the activities, and, the additional information section, just to sort of just quickly run through it. A lot of her bullet points were really good. A lot of the last episode, I was talking a lot about just the students' bullet points were not good for describing their activities in the activities list, or their honors. I was talking a lot about formatting, but also just like the tone was off. It was way too informal. It was joking. It was, as I referred to, cutesy. This student actually, when she sent over a lot of her contributions in the activities, they were very crisp, right? Like they had a lot of like active verb phrases, contributed this, led this, spearheaded that. It had like, measurable impact. I was, show leadership in those activities, the relevance of the activities in the bullet points. So she actually was very good and starting from a very good intuitive place already in terms of her packaging of a lot of these activities. What I'm going to focus on more, even though I can dive into a little bit of these, details. What I'm gonna focus on is just sort of the, does this go in the awards, or did I make this an award, or what's the ordering and why, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm mostly gonna focus on the high level packaging of her awards, activities, and additional information section. So kicking things off there, for the award section, I would put the NISLE Indonesia semifinalist number 1. This is a little bit of a back and forth, and again, as I've mentioned, this is an art. It's not, it definitely has a lot of science aspects to it, but the application is quite a bit of an art, and there's a lot of judgment calls. There's no absolute black and white right or wrong answer. As I've also mentioned, a lot of people sort of, they want to hear from an admissions officer, as though an admissions officer is going to be able to describe how all admissions officers think. And I've called this the monolith myth. Admissions officers are all different, unique human beings, right? And they all have their own different variants, the way they're feeling in a moment. They're all their personal experiences, their biases, as much as they try to remove it. They're human beings. A lot of this is just art and it's judgment calls, right? And so if we surveyed 50 different admissions offers and we said, "Do you think that the student would have been better off putting this one number 1 or number 2?" You probably would just get 25 people who say, on a close judgment call, 25 would say this one and 25 would have preferred that one, and it's a coin toss, right? Now there are other things that are, like, very hard and fast or really big egregious mistakes, like I mentioned the tone and the other students' activities list in the last episode. There might be 1 or 2 admissions officers out of a whole bunch that would like it, but most of them would not like it. It's just not an appropriate, too informal, too casual of a tone for very more serious objective parts of the application. There's definitely a science, there are definitely guardrails. There's a lot of it that is very systematic and very linearly strategic, but there are also just very close judgment calls, right? So for her awards, I went with putting the NISLE, the National Security Language Initiative for Youth Indonesia semifinals, as number one because I just think it's more impressive. And so for a lot of the sort of ordering of these activities, usually looking at two factors. One is the overall impressiveness, and second is the relevance to the hook, right? And so there are times where the overall impressiveness will just be, compared to maybe an activity that's relevant to the hook, but it's just a much weaker or less impressive activity or award. And in that case, in some cases, I do just go with the overall, the stronger signal, the big award, even though it's not as relevant, just because the overall impressiveness kind of overshadows maybe the much less impressive, albeit relative activity or award, right? So that's basically what I did here. The NISLE is more of the international relations, international sort of global studies theme, which is not her number one theme. However, I put it number one because it is the most impressive out of her awards. Number two, which I would have slightly have preferred, but I just don't think it's as impressive as the diversity conference. So this is more relevant to the sociology, her number one theme, but it just wasn't as impressive as the NISLE by a margin. So I put this as number two, and for this, the diversity conference representative, she sort of hit the nail on the head with sort of the framing. So selected to be one of 8 representatives from her school at a diversity conference, and it was organized by whatever the organization is. You're not gonna be able to fit all of that into because this is just an honor award, but you should definitely get the 1 out of 8 representatives, and then put, for a diversity conference you were selected. So that's the award part of it, is the selection and the number, how many were chosen, potentially out of how many, and, what is it for? That's an award, that's a selection. And so in the last episode, we were talking about the Bank of America Student Leadership Program, and I was sort of differentiating the award side of that from the activity side of that, right? The award side of it is your selection out of this number of applicants. That is sort of that's the main signal. Then there's what you actually get out of the activity or your bullet points in the activity. Like, what did you actually do once you were now selected, right? So, I view them as sort of, separate constructs in some cases where you have something and there's sort of an award aspect of it, and then there's an activity aspect of it. And the award, again, is the selection component or the scarcity component, and the activity component, as you would expect, is the activity of it, right? And if an award has no activity to it, right, there's no resulting activity, then it's much closer to just an award proper. I am going to take this diversity conference. I'm focusing on the selection part of it for the awards, and then we're also going to focus on the activity part of it and make it an activity as well. So we could give her one more relevant activity in the activities list and also beef up that sociology theme a little bit more in the activity. So we're kind of getting a 2 for 1 out of this activity because it does have both components. Number 3, the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Award. So that's going to be number 3. It's more relevant to the international relations, sort of the global theme. And then for number 4, since she doesn't have a ton of awards, this isn't a very impressive award. It's what I refer to commonly as an epiphenomenal award, which means it doesn't convey. It's not really an epiphenomenal award in the true sense. Epiphenomenal means basically it doesn't convey any new information. It's not a phenomenon in and of itself. And that's for something like a student gets an honor roll at a high school, right? It's like, well, I have their transcript. I can clearly see what their grades were, right? So it's an award that is essentially redundant with other information in the application. Now, this College Board School Recognition Award, it's not per se redundant, right? I don't maybe have the exact percentile elsewhere in terms of how she did on the PSAT compared to, other students at her high school or whatnot. So it's not exactly, in the true sense, as I usually define an epiphenomenal award, the way that an honor roll would be. But it is kind of somewhat redundant with other information. And she may not be putting in her PSAT score in the application, but it's just something that's kind of already coming from the metrics of her application. And so it's not a very, it's just like the AP Scholar Awards. You can put them in your, if you don't have a lot of honors or awards, you could put them in your top five in the main award section. It's very redundant with other information in your application because I already have your AP scores, right? Elsewhere in the application, or I should, because you should have done well in the reporting the AP scores. These sort of college board, these recognition awards, honor rolls, they're just not the most impressive awards, AP Scholar Awards. And they only go in the top five in the award section if you just don't have enough awards to fill up that section otherwise. So in her case, she has three main relevant awards, and then she doesn't have enough for four and five for anything that would be better or more relevant. At least at this point, I think the student's high school does have a fall awards ceremony where they give out different awards to the seniors. Some high schools have that at the end of spring in junior year, or they might have both. And then they have a fall ceremony. Some schools only have one in the spring, after you apply to college, late spring when they give out valedictorian. Sometimes they give out other awards. At that point in time, hopefully you do it before your applications. The student might get another award that's better, more relevant to her narrative, and then she could put that in the award section. But as it stands, number 4 will be the College Board School Recognition Award. For her activities, the one that I like the most, I know a lot of people know that I'm a big research homer. I have a research background, so I will state the bias there. But in terms of the value of the different activities, the research project's super cool. She does it with the university professor. It's a sociology professor. It's a cool project. It's a niche project, oral history. It's like in a specific time period. Like it's just very niche, a very niche, relevant research connected to a university. She has some good contributions, and she's hitting some of the good bullet points here that should go in the activities. Don't put responsible for because there's just too many words. You're just not going to have enough words for the activities list description. But, it'd be things like found, organize, analyze information for the themes of make sure to be very specific in the activities list, right? So she put in the bullet point here, and this wasn't meant to be a final version, common application description, right? She was just sending me her resume bullets. But don't put things like analyzing information to see if it aligns with the themes of his research, right? You have to be very specific. What are the themes of his research? So get specific with analyzed trends in X specific topic, right? And students are really bad at this throughout the essays, throughout the bullets in their activities. They are very vague and they use just a lot of fluff. A lot of them do it because that hasn't been punished enough or punished badly enough by their high school teachers. I would have a saying, like I would say, vague and generic or whatever, right? And the student would just eventually, if I would say, what's wrong with this? They're just like, it'd be like almost a knee-jerk reaction. They'd be like, oh, this is just vague, right? It needs to be more specific. It needs to be more specific. It needs to be more. You have to keep reminding them it's too vague. It needs to be more specific, more specific, more specific, more specific, right? Specificity is the best for essays. You say, I love, this field. It's like you have to get very specific about what it is that you love about the field, the very specific topics, the very specific terms, right? And so you want a very high degree of laser-like precision and specificity. And a lot of students have just seen that their natural impulse is to always keep going back to fluff, right? She's like, they keep just putting words and fluff. Part of it too is because of word count restrictions, right? So part of the reason why they keep reverting back to more generic terms is because they're shorter. It might be more difficult, right, to be both specific and concise, but you want to put in max effort to accomplish both of them. So the activities descriptions are very short, and so it's very easy just to kind of compress it by being very generic, right? Researched sociology themes. What sociology themes, right? So, you do have to try to be both compressed and compact and concise, but also hyper specific, right? So you should not be putting things like themes of his research. I don't know what that means. What themes of his research? Another bullet point here, she puts conducted extensive archival research. That's fine. Locate and vet secondary primary sources, organize any findings, and synthesize findings, right? That's fine. You're not going to be able to be hyper specific for at each and every single bullet point, but just make sure that if I read it, it's not all just like researched, information, analyzed themes, like located sources. Like it's just like there should be at least a little bit in these activities list descriptions. Essays, you have more ability to talk more and to be more specific. But for the activities list descriptions, you should try to have some hyper specificity in there and try to avoid vagueness as much as you possibly can. So that I think is number one. That research project I think is great. For number two, she also put the project will eventually become a published work. That's great as well. You could potentially put that in the activities list description, though it is quite a bit tentative. Another idea is you could also potentially break this out and put this in the additional information section. And if there's enough bullets or enough contributions where the student really has a lot that they can go into a lot of civic detail about, as mentioned, like running a business, an organization, a very significant and involved research project, you can put that in additional information section and talk about it more, right? So if you feel like there are a lot of very compelling, significant contributions in this activity, and the activities list is just way too short, but there's like you could do like 6 or 7 bullets or something that are like really good contributions, you can put that in the additional information section. I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the additional info. Number two, multiracial affinity club. So this again hits the sociology theme, as does the research project with the professor and the book. So she put organization targeting students who identify as multiracial. Within the club, I facilitate discussion activities about race, intersectionality, challenges of being multiracial, and across a larger student body, building awareness and hosting events. Our biggest event was a required school-wide dinner where we shared a presentation and shared fusion foods with the community. There are approximately 21 members, started as a member my freshman year and have been the co-president since my sophomore year. So the co-president, I mentioned before, if you've built your way up in an activity, just put the terminal or the final most impressive designation. Don't put like member, then vice president, or member, then secretary. It's too much. It's just not concise, and just put the most impressive title. So for this will just be in the title, which will just be co-president. And then she has a lot of good bullets here. You're just gonna have to shorten it. Spearheaded this event. Don't put there are 21 members. Who cares how many members there are in the club, right? This is meant to be a reflection of what you did for the club. So if you grew the membership of the club from 10 to 21 members, you could put something, okay, well, how would we frame that in the way that would sound the best? Increase the club's membership by over 100%, right? Because it's over 100%, right? We're doubling it. We could do something like that, like you grew the membership, but don't put details about just the activity itself, right? That doesn't show what you actively did. And ideally, if it's not 100% clear what the activity is and you feel like you need to kind of describe or set the context for the activity, try to describe the activity through active contributions, right? So if I'm not really sure about what like this book thing is, well then, in the process of reading about her, what she was researching for the book, I probably would have a better sense through that, right? But don't waste very precious space just describing the activity, because then you're not really conveying any activeness or what you're doing or your contributions. And this application is not meant to give them a list of clubs at your high school and a synopsis of each of the clubs or of these, what a professor at some random university is writing a book about. It's an application about you, and it's meant to convey your relationship to those activities, right? So don't waste a lot of time describing activities. You just don't have the space. Okay, number three, the Youth Ambassador Program Nigeria. So we are kind of interweaving a bit of the primary positioning and the secondary positioning between the sociology and the sort of international relations. They do dovetail a little bit, as I've mentioned. Some of this can be weakly under the umbrella of sociology. It's not really the best for the Youth Ambassador Program, Algeria, Middle East here, but some of the bullets do sound very much sociology-like. So it's not like they're super disparate. The interweaving is totally fine. And the reason why you put this as number three is because it's the overall value tends to be quite a bit higher, right? So for the first two, I would probably say her Youth Ambassador Program Algeria is more impressive. It is more impressive than the Multiracial Affinity Club. The reason why I put Multiracial Affinity Club as number two instead of number three is because it hits more of the sociology theme that I want to hit, particularly in the beginnings of sections, ideally, right? specifically activities list. You want to hit that ideally. That's why the multiracial affinity club went a little bit before. It was more of the sociology theme that I wanted to hit or established earlier in the activities list, even though I don't think it was as impressive overall of an activity as this youth ambassador program, this fully funded Department of State program. This is going to go number 3. She has different bullets in here. Don't put very vague bullets like application process, including transcripts, recommendations, essays. Like, don't put that. Like, any process for any competitive program includes those materials. It's just not necessary. You can put, funded Department of State youth and earned, right? Don't put fully funded. Put active verbs, earned, you know, State Department. You're gonna have to shorten things. U.S. State Department, scholarship, and then put for, and then put what you're doing in the activity, leadership training, civic participation, etc. Meeting NGO leaders, like then you would just put it, you have to just really compress things down. And you could put something maybe like the 8 US high school students were chosen. This is a very small amount, sort of just reinforces the scarcity. Again, it's just like it's getting across like what were some of the contents of the activity, like what are you doing? NGO leaders, very specific, be specific about the activity, but you're gonna have to kind of frame it as though, what you were doing and try to not make it sound. I know some of these programs just have like you're just attending or you're just listening, but you have to really resist the urge to put bullets like that. Even if it's true, if you just put attended lectures by blah blah blah, like it's just not active, it's not impressive, it's not good. So you have to try to bring out the parts where you were active, right? Like engaged in panels, not like was lectured by people who are smart. Like, right? We can see the difference. This is a lot of the difference, and the issue with a lot of students is they're like hyper literalists, right? They're just like waste space, just like describing the activity, and they're not self-branding correctly. It just sounds more impressive if you were the active center and the main character. This is a note for everybody. A lot of programs, courses, etc., activities will have something like, you attended a seminar, you were lectured, etc., but that's about other people and it just makes you sound like a passive bystander. It's just not what you want for your activities list descriptions or anywhere in your application. Number 4, diversity conference representative. So we got the selection part in the award. Now we're doubling this up and we're making an activity. So now we have to focus on the activity parts. Again, the reason why I split this into both an award and an activity, you get a 2-for-1 here, but we can further reinforce the sociology theme in the activities list because there weren't a ton of activities that she has. And some of them towards the bottom, we kind of have to make relevant, like the McDonald's, potentially the writer and the newspaper editor, the youth advisory counselor, more of a stretch in terms of relevance to her hooks. She kind of really only had 3 activities that were as relevant, that were relevant to her hooks. So I really wanted to squeeze this diversity conference representative and make it an activity as well to give her extra relevant activity. So for this one, we have to focus on the second bullet point that she put, or the second and third, which is she put speakers on the importance of DEI and gave us insights to bring back to our school. Don't frame it that way against the same thing like you're just there listening to speakers who are smart. Don't put it that way. What was much better was the other bullet that she had, which is presented key learnings and recapped experiences for the entire school faculty. That's great. That's active. That's presented. So I took this knowledge. We compressed it. We then, created PowerPoints. We then recapped it for the school faculty back in the high school, right? That's active. That's a great bullet point, right? But you're getting an extra bullet point here for what you do when you're actually at the conference. That's not just listening to other people talk, right? The other thing that I'll say, and this isn't even coming from me, again, I try to remain as neutral as possible when it comes to anything related to politics or religion or or whatever. I'm just neutral. I'm just trying to just look at this purely from the standpoint. Everything that we do when it comes to advising, it's just goal optimization. There's 2 columns, either helps you get into the college or doesn't. I know a lot of people don't like when I talk about summers and the kid who's working in a research lab over the summer instead of going to summer camp. It's just going to have a much better shot at attending a top college, and they don't like that. But I am looking at it purely through the lens of goal optimization in this very specific context, which is the podcast that we have, which is related to gaining admission to top colleges. If you want to expand your focus and talk about fun or happiness or, all these other gratuitous notions. I'm kidding, kidding. You can, but then the thing is, it makes it very confusing because for the kid who is trying to optimize to go to a top college, I'm like, go to summer camp, and they're like, well, you're telling me the thing like I don't want to. I want to know what I need to do to go to a top college, right? It makes things very confusing, right? So try to make things very precise and very specific by saying in this little tiny microcosm, this little world of this podcast that is hyper specific and hyper niche, these are the things that maximize this very specific goal, right? And the goal is admission to these top and highly selective colleges. And so then we just draw two categories and we say either maximizes the probability of achieving that goal or doesn't maximize the probability of achieving that goal, right? And summer camp, if it's some extremely relevant summer camp, you want to be an education major in science education or something, there are things that can be made relevant or that have relevance that just are not usually relevant. So there's obviously always nuances there, but as I've talked about with the job, my point here is everything that I say is meant simply to either it's just two categories. And the main category we're concerned about is help the student gain admission to a top and highly selective college. I don't talk at all about whether you should want that goal or what this college is better or the reasons. I don't care, right? You got to come to the podcast knowing that that's what you want. But once you've arrived knowing that that's what you want, my job is simply to help people achieve that objective. So I don't care about any of the political, the religious. I've mentioned this before. From a strategic perspective, I do think you have to be careful with polarizing content. And I've mentioned that a lot on this podcast. But when we're talking about this diversity conference, and she mentions the term DI here, I don't give a damn one way or the other, right? However, there have been multiple parents and students recently who've actually brought this up and have asked. One parent recently said, sort of the term, because their student actually has very similar positioning to this student's narrative. In fact, I think they might have actually been at the same conference. The parent said, obviously with a lot of, sort of what's going on, this term DI is sort of like their words, not mine, is radioactive. So there have been students and parents who sort of wondered about whether this could maybe be, taken the wrong way, given the current zeitgeist. First of all, admissions officers, I think everybody knows, are predominantly skewed in one political direction a lot more. They're much more predominantly liberal. And so a lot of these themes, they're going to be received a lot better than potentially, in our last students podcast, the National Rifle, the NRA, it's not going to be received nearly as well. Maybe in certain states, maybe you're talking about Southern states, there are obviously different institutions. There are Catholic institutions, there are religious institutions. You have to be aware of who your audience is. And that's not even just political or religious. I've talked about this in the context of if you have an engineering committee, if you're applying and there's a specific engineering evaluation process that's separate and there's a different engineering school. For example, at Duke, there's Pratt versus Trinity, right? Pratt is the engineering. If you have faculty and specific types of faculty, they don't look at things the same as a lay admissions officer in Trinity, right? There's different ratings for the application. Who Duke did recently do away with a lot of the ratings. Engineering faculty view the world differently than some communications major from Elon who now works in Trinity, in the liberal arts college at Duke, right? So you always have to be aware of your audience, right? It's not even just political, religious, etc. That being said, most of academia, most admissions departments, most of higher ed does skew predominantly liberal. And so a lot of diversity is not going to be much of the DI. They're going to be quite amenable to it. That being said, if you want to potentially attenuate any of this, you could just be just very simple. If there's sort of a word that's a little bit charged or an abbreviation, you're not sure how it's going to land. We had a student last cycle who was in sort of the field of abortion. You can frame things differently without using very hard hitting, very charged words like abortion, for example, right? You could talk about healthcare or women's healthcare rights or something like that. So for DI, if you did want to soften it a little bit, and again, this is just because a lot of people have asked me specifically about this, you could just say diversity. right? Or some other framing. I just wanted to just bring that up because there have been a lot of people who have brought this to my attention again because admissions is very skews very liberal and very receptive to a lot of these diversity themes. You're not normally going to have much of an issue at all. I would be more worried about the other student, as I mentioned, who had an award and it was the NRA. Again, I don't care, but I know who the audience is. You're going to find a more amenable audience here, but still need to at least be somewhat aware of what you're mentioning in the application if you do want to just remove some of the potential risk there of how it might land or how it might just land to a very particular person, right? Again, admissions is not a monolith. It's not everybody has the same belief, the same ideology, the same personality, the same experiences, grew up the same place, the same educational background. Like it's not a monolith, right? There's a whole bunch of different people, right, who are admissions officers. So you have to take that into account, but very easy to potentially change a word or two if you are so inclined and worried about it. So this diversity conference representative, when you were at the conference, the student just has to make it not just being like listening to speakers, right? It has to be much more active. For number 5, youth advisory council. So this is now we're getting to the back end of the activities, and these are getting harder to make relevant to the student's positioning, at least on their surface. Youth Advisory Council. Now, she's the co-president senior year, so it's not bad in terms of a leadership perspective, but it's a little bit more kind of public health. Like if the student were positioning for public health, it wouldn't have to be explained the relevance, right? I would just see public health and I would see anti-vaping, suicide, drinking, etc. These issues that are relevant to the teenage population. Now, I think that bullet point, and don't put its purpose is to raise awareness. Again, you're not describing the activities, you're describing your contributions, and you hope via the contributions, it's clear via the specificity of those contributions what the content or what the activity actually is about. Youth Advisory Council is a fairly generic term, so I wouldn't get it from just the title of the activity per se. It would be more like propose solutions to issues, not its purpose is to raise awareness, right? Raised awareness and propose solutions to issues relevant to the teenage population, such as anti-vaping, suicide, drinking. That's very specific. Again, notice the specificity there, right? Very specific issues: anti-vaping, suicide, drinking, etc. A high degree of specificity. I don't know if you can fit anything that would maybe tap a little bit more into the sociology side, or if there was anything sort of, when you do the multiracial club, multiracial affinity club, like it's just very obvious. Like I could just see the connection to the sociology theme and, to a lesser extent, sort of the global international relations, some of those themes. It's not as clear with the Youth Advisory Council or even some of these more public health. So if there was anything ethnicity or racial or diversity or anything in there that would just be more on the nose of the positioning, you might want to try to fit it in there. I could see a little bit of the connection from because these are like societal issues, sort of besetting a particular segment of society in the teenage population or adolescence. So it's definitely sociologically related, but you might want to try to hit it a little bit more on the nose with some of the bullet points. Though again, the raising awareness, the proposing solutions to the issues relevant to the teenage population, anti-vaping, suicide, drinking, is pretty good, right? But you want to maybe there's another one that you can put in there as well, sort of conveying your active contributions while also trying to reinforce even more some of the relevance to the overall positioning themes. Number 6, so we're getting less relevant as we go here towards the bottom. So the editor of the newspaper, if the student hasn't written any articles that hit some of the main themes of this application that are ethnicity related or anything related to the sociology themes or diversity themes or global studies or even something like she went on a trip to this country or whatever it is or when she gets back in the summer or the fall, if she hasn't done this in the past, I would strongly suggest to start writing some articles or start curating or soliciting some articles as an editor or creating a column or doing something before you apply to college that will hit that sort of global theme. It could be something like like a travel blog like article or something you did, in this ambassador program over the summer or something. If you're still actively writing and not just editing articles, or you can invite other students to do so with their summer travels and sort of, taking a diversity perspective or diversity of cultures or something. If it hasn't been done in the past, if there's no articles in the past that have been edited or written by the students that would make this relevant to the broader application themes, then I would particularly be inclined to try to do this before. I would try to do this before applying and try to fit some of that in there. Otherwise, it just looks like just a standalone activity, and it's fine, right? It's just, editor of the newspaper. She's got some leadership. She's been editor since 10th grade. It's fine for the people out there sort of like, everything has to be relevant to the hook or whatever. It's just how many newspaper editors are there, for goodness sake? How many newspaper editors are there in the United States, right? I say all the time, it's 30,000 high schools. There's like 30,000 editors of the newspaper, right? It's just like not a very uncommon activity, right? It's very common. So, it's not as relevant. She's not a student, it would have been more relevant to the student in the episode that we just did, where the student was more, in creative writing or writing, it would have been a little bit better. It wouldn't have been any more unique or differentiating per se, but it's not really on its surface that relevant to the student's narrative, and it's not that rare in general among the student population. So we do have to get a little bit more juice out of this activity by emphasizing the relevance to her hook and her positioning, and also making it a little bit more niche and interesting by tying it back to what are her actual passions, which seem to be along these lines of, the global studies, international relations, diversity, sociology, etc. So that's what I would suggest. Either try to think of articles in the past that would be relevant to these themes or things that you've done, or try to do it before you apply. You don't have to just do it for college applications. You should do it because you want to do it because it seems like a student is passionate about these topics, and it's a good way of tying together their interests and activities that they already do, but bringing their other passions or interests to activities that they're already doing. Number 7 here, this will be the McDonald's being the full-time employee. It just has no on the surface relevance to any of the themes per se. Like you just put McDonald's and then whatever the student's position is, at McDonald's. In the bullets, if there's anything relevant, like I've mentioned another example is a student who was doing mock trial and she was positioning for theater. And so she talked about sort of the performance aspects of the mock trial activity. For example, okay, so the student has a lot of language proficiency, right? She doubled up on, multiple languages. She self-studied in Spanish. If there were any coworkers at McDonald's to whom she spoke Spanish, she might put something like that in here. Now, you have to talk about it in a way that's not like weird. Like this isn't an essay. This is an activities list description. If there's anything about, maybe helped facilitate communication among employees and, that relates to the Spanish or the bilingual communication, or I mean, if she unveiled some bilingual, communication program or materials or pamphlets at McDonald's or, some obviously that would be great. I just, it obviously is constrained by what the student actually did. I can't just make it up and lie. I don't know what she did. It would obviously be a little bit more convenient if I had her, or, right here in front of me. I would just be looking for anything such as that language coming into play, anything socioeconomic, anything you can sort of dig up, but don't make it too weird or like way too forced. And also understand that you can also hit this in some of the essays. I don't know enough to be able to advise as to how this would even whether this should be in the essays or how it should unfold. There are some potentially, cool scenes here from the McDonald's that do have a lot of really cool aspects or cool anecdotes, and if they do intersect at all with any of the diversity themes or the sociological themes, they could make for really great supplements or even possibly a great personal essay. She has a lot of relevant experiences, state-funded program, her club, the book that she's writing, which doesn't lend as well to stories or experiences per se, but it could, right? If you can sort of tell it in a very interesting way, you're at your computer and you're researching and you're diving into this book, like you just have to really dress it up as a story. Things that are like, I was in this other country, as part of this program, like that lends to a little bit of better storytelling. Same thing as with the McDonald's, like you're in a place, a time, there's the smell of stuff that you like. It can be a lot more sensory. And so it does lend itself very well to storytelling in the essays. Some of this could potentially go in the essays. Don't get weird about it. You don't want to overly force it into the activities list description here. But again, if there's any of that content, the language, the diversity from a global perspective, socioeconomic, sociological, any of that you can fit into the McDonald's, I would try to do so in the description. Outside of that, you just put anything that's just, impressive, innovated a cashier protocol, whatever outside of that. Regardless, even if she can't fit in anything that's, like, hyper relevant to the narrative, I do still like, even just on the surface, the counter signaling against just having the very, just the private school kid who goes to a school at $75,000 a year tuition. I do like the counter signaling, and I do like the uniqueness of this. It's likable. For all the people who I think throw shade, as the kids would say, about, college advising and sort of the white collar and privilege and, all that stuff. I actually think, and I really try to promote this among students, our students, and on the podcast, I've obviously said this. I think the importance of having a high degree of perseverance, being high agency, being very gritty. I often say, like, and this is like, I guess, charged a lot nowadays, immigrant mentality. Very like blue collar work ethic, I think is very likable in the applications. And again, you have to keep in mind the admissions officers are not, this isn't somebody who stepped down from running a hedge fund to work in admissions, right? This isn't some MD from Goldman Sachs. You do have to understand your audience, as I've said before. I do think that the sort of the student, because a lot of these students, I think about this a lot of times. I'm in New York City, and I'll see, there's a lot of people hustling, right? They're selling something. They're out there, they're like walking up to strangers. Somebody in Central Park, they're selling something, and then I think about all these kids who say that they're interested in business, right? And they're like, they're interested in, the finance, the investment banking. It's like, just go to, like, Central Park for a day if you're a kid in New York City, like, you're interested in business, like, I just like the hustlers, right? Like, the gritty entrepreneurs. It's cliche for sure, right? But the kid who had a limit, like, the kid who, like, actually shows they care, they're willing to go out there on a Saturday, it's 92 degrees, they're willing to hustle. So I really like that if you can signal, particularly if you come from privilege, you go to a private school, if you can convey that blue collar sort of, pull up your sleeves work ethic, you work in a McDonald's full time, like, I really like that. And admissions officers will certainly appreciate it as well. So even if she can't fit in, again, some of the more, relevant or sort of more of the bougie, high level intellectual vitality, sociology themes. I think that's great, but there's another side of this that she will be able to get across just by virtue of the fact of that she actually did put herself out and was willing to work here. And, it's just not very common for a lot of students, particularly who come from private school backgrounds, to be full-time employees at McDonald's. Then for the additional information section, so she actually had, I think either in activities or awards that she originally sent, she had their certificate in global studies that I mentioned from her high school, which is this sort of this program. And you have to take these different global studies courses. You have to do the capstone, co-curricular project. I don't know if the co-curricular project was the research on the book with the professor. If it was, I'm going to suggest that she talk about the certificate in global studies in the additional information section. It's just not really an activity, and it's just hard to frame as an activity, and it's just got too many different components, and the activities list is just too short. The descriptions, it can't really be branded as an award. It's already a stretch to brand it as an award. She hasn't gotten the certificate yet. It's still pending, so she can't make it an award in the award section. It's hard to put in the activity section. So what I would suggest is put this in the additional information section, the certificate in global studies. If the co-curricular project as part of getting the certificate in global studies was that research project with the professor on the book, then that also will allow you to talk a little bit more about potentially that project and do some overflow description that doesn't potentially fit in the first activity list description of just that research project. Either way, talk about the requirements here, like what you had to do to get the certificate in global studies, because it's a lot of different things. And then I do really like this capstone project. The problem is it hasn't happened yet, right? But I do really like the idea for this capstone project, which is mental health perceptions and care in developed and developing countries. This is, again, a good example just for other people listening. When I say, like, be niche and have niche interests, niche topics, again, it's very specific, right? It's like, perceptions, what kind, mental health perceptions and care in developed versus developing countries, right? And so again, every single time we would go to do a survey of the applicant pool, how many other students would have a project like this, right? For this is probably not zero. There are some where you're just like, there's nobody in the entire applicant pool at Stanford who's going to have the same activity. Like, just nobody. It's just so niche and so weird and different. Like, there's just none. She's definitely approximating that. It's a cool niche, and this is why I like research a lot is because when you're doing these capsules and these research, they are almost definitionally very specific, right? Like, they are on very specific topics. It's, this set of people in this country and on this topic in post-colonial wherever, right? Or 1970s America or, whatever it is, right? So that's research is very amenable to other strategically, optimal aspects, namely that it's almost by definition, a lot of research projects are very niche, right? Like they are very focused and very specific in a way that broad subjects in school tend not to be. I really like this capstone project. I think it's really cool. I think it's very sociology relevant. It's very sort of international globally relevant. So I really like it. And I would definitely make sure it gets across here in the additional information section. I wish we could take more credit for it as sort of a finished project, which unfortunately we can't. But I would definitely make sure to get this across in the additional information section. And then finally, I'm going to go through some of the activities and activities that I removed that I don't really think make the cut or they're very marginal and would have to have some other aspect to even consider them. So for number one, she's a tour guide at her high school. I can't tell you how common this is or how many students we see of ours who go to private high schools, and they're all like admissions ambassadors, tour guide. It's just like if it seems like every kid who goes to a private school like has this activity, which should for somebody listening who's like, oh yeah, my kid does that thing too, and they go to a private school. Like it's just you're just not aware of these things unless you have the bird's eye view and you sort of see a whole bunch of other kids' candidacies. Some of them, even think is like it might actually be like a bit prestigious at the school to get it. Like there are accolades that are, like at a student's high school, they're like very, they seem to carry like a lot of social value or they seem very prestigious or very impressive, but they're just not at all from like an admissions perspective, right? And so this is one of them. Like it just doesn't matter. Like it's not relevant to anything. The only thing would be like if she were, like there was some diversity relevance here, or there was like some students who were students of color that she was, well, like she spearheaded some program. Again, if there's something that's relevant, it's just like there's a lot of categories of activities that are just not usually impressive or relevant or like jobs or whatnot. But if you happen to be the exception, where, you're doing a summer camp and you're a science teacher because you want to be a science teacher, like, okay, there's exceptions to the rules, right? Just not usually the case with this type of activity that's going to be relevant or impressive. So I would generally remove it unless there's something to be squeezed out of it that would be relevant. Number two that I don't think should make the cut. So she was a College Board SAT tutor. She was selected. This might have been connected to the award or that combination. I don't know. To do a free SAT virtual tutoring session, which is interesting, but it was only one session. It's too minor. It's not relevant to anything. Camp counselor. She was a camp counselor. This is the type of stuff that I really like. It's just very common. So this is like the total opposite of the McDonald's, which is like camp counselor. Like camp counselor, lifeguard, two most common cliche activities among jobs and students that they potentially put in their applications or just jobs that they have in general. At an overnight camp for middle school girls at her high school, camp focused on developing leadership skills. Again, if there was something relevant to any of the sociology or, ethnicity or multiracial or the international global, then you consider putting it towards the end of the activities. But unless that's the case, so it just wouldn't make the application, wouldn't make the final film trailer, as I say. And then for sports, she did varsity track and JV soccer all years. I'm not really sure how you could do JV soccer for all years. I don't know. Varsity track, um, if you were the captain of a sport or connected to the sport, you had some just like interesting contributions. Like for example, as part of a sport, you like raised a lot of money for like fundraisers, or we had one student who was on the football team. They were like working with like a special needs organization and like working with the kids and like inviting to the practices. If there's something like that, particularly something impressive, like where you're really spearheading or running, raising a lot of funds, or there's anything relevant somehow. Also, if you are a student, and I did this with the student last year who was the application strategy for high school senior episode. He just had a bunch of sports, and we had to find a way to make it relevant because he was applying in like a month to college. And the way that we made it relevant was we came up with sort of I think it was like a sports management, sports business sort of angle that I came up with for him, because we were just basically squeezing water out of a stone at that point. If you can squeeze some water out of a stone, or you have some interesting thing that you spearheaded, you're the captain of the team of a varsity team, or you can find some relevance to your hook, then those are sort of exceptions for sports outside of course, being a recruited athlete. If you have more firepower behind the sport, then you can put it towards the end of the activities list. Or again, if you have some sports relevant positioning, not necessarily being a recruited athlete, though obviously that would hold true. But if you're just doing something related to sports in college, sports business, sports management, sports communication, sports broadcasting, sports journalism, there's a million different sports statistics, sports analytics. So there's a million different intersections of sports. Then obviously your sports are relevant in that case. Setting that aside, being a recruited athlete, having sports relevant positioning, then you really kind of need to be, like, at the upper levels of the sport, like varsity, captain. Like, the very low end of sports is, like, JV, soccer, I was just on the team. Like, that is just not really good to put in your activities list because it's just highly dilutionary, and there's nothing relevant. You didn't, like, fundraise anything, you're not positioning for anything sports related, you're not like, there's just nothing in the activity, basically. It's just a dead activity. If the varsity track, if there was something in there for captain, there's just more juice to squeeze, it's okay, and the student doesn't have a full activities list anyway. For student, like in the prior episode, where there's a lot of activities, there's a million different awards that are going to the additional information section, it just feels really weird to just put, like, a random sport in there, like JV soccer among, like, a whole bunch of really impressive activities and accomplishments that are it's just really weird. Again, it's like it's just a person who's, like, applying for a job when they're 30 and they're putting, like, cashier at Target when they were 14. It's just like, "What are you doing?" If there's something more impressive that you could add here, some relevance you could find, or some fundraising, or you're a captain, or just anything impressive, particularly more with the varsity, then you can maybe put it in the end of the activities list. But as currently construed, I don't have any of that information that would make it more impressive. I would just remove it. Now, basically, we're going to get to the final part here, which is a school and ED analysis. So, again, this was one of the parts that, when the data originally reached out, this is one of the things that he mentioned, which is just this very high stakes decision that I've mentioned in terms of choosing, the EDs, making sure that you're choosing them correctly. Not every school, not every college has early decision, as many people will know. But the students' top colleges do have early decision. At least two of the top three also have early decision too. They have ED and they have ED2. So this is a very high stakes situation in terms of, do we do ED here? Do we do ED2 there? What do we do? And how do we get maximum mileage? Because as I've mentioned very often on this podcast, if you do not choose these correctly and then you end up in the regular decision pool at these colleges, those rates drop precipitously, and you are just far less likely to gain admission. There are a lot of liabilities that I've talked about on this podcast. When you're in the regular decision round, you have tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of applications. They don't know that you're coming, so there's a yield protection issue because you don't have a binding commitment. They're much more likely to have found your narrative and people in your subsegment demographically, whatever it is. They've already admitted kids from your high school in the ED round at that college. They don't need any more of you, whatever more of you means, right? They don't need more kids from New York. They don't need more white kids. They don't need more Asian kids. They don't need more environmental science majors because they already have enough of them. Like, that's just what it is, right? It's just you're divided up into a whole, but they don't need more males, they need more females. You're divided up into all these different dimensions, majors, departments, it might not be formalized. They can't technically, due to the affirmative action ruling, on its surface, just nominally use race or ethnicity, but they could use it in a holistic sense based on the essays, the students' activities, right? They could definitely get your ethnicity. I've said this a lot. Your name is very often, there's a pretty high predictive ability to figure out some, ethnicity based on a person's name. Obviously, it depends on what the ethnicity is or the race. That is what admissions is, right? And so a lot of students, they're like very surprised by the variance of admissions. Like, oh, I didn't get in here, but then I got in there. And like these two schools are the same, or the school that I got into is even better than the one that I didn't get into. A lot of it comes down to the fact that these are like different teams. The best analogy to use here is like these are different teams. And they're basically recruiting. And so if you're a point guard, you can be the best point guard in the world, but if the team already has 3 point guards, they don't need you. Right. If you were, a recruited athlete and you're a quarterback, you could be the best quarterback in the world, but if they already have, 3 freshman quarterbacks, who are amazing, on the team, they don't need you, right? And so a lot of people wanna look at it as like, "Oh, I'm the best quarterback," but that's not how it works. It's, do they need quarterbacks, right? So when you get to the regular decision round, they have way more people, right? They've already filled a bunch of the class. And if they have ED and EB2, they've already filled 60% of the class. Again, there's a lot of benefits to the ED that I've laid out, right? It's way fewer applicants. You have the yield production mechanism, your signaling bindings. I won't sort of recap everything here, but they seem to get it. A lot of people seem not to get it. Unfortunately, they seem to get it, and so they understand the importance of sort of getting this high stakes decision right. And so we're gonna talk about it here. So I had this student basically, they used sort of our own school feedback, visit feedback sheets that we use with a lot of our own students in our advising program. I sent to them. So they filled this out. They had a whole bunch of schools that they saw that they didn't like. They rated 3, 4, NYU 4, Cornell 6, Barnard 7. So I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm basically just going to start by going through the schools that they rated at least an 8 or above. And also their parents also gave feedback, but I'm going to focus on the ones that the student rated an 8 or above, and all of those the parents also rated an 8 or above as well. There were some the parents rated like an 8 or a 9, the student gave a 6, but I'm going to assume that those are not viable because the student just doesn't like them very much. We're going to focus on the ones where the student and the parents gave at least an 8 or above. So that starts with Smith College, which a whole bunch of people I know probably right now listening are like, what the heck is Smith College? No offense, I think the student's mom went to Smith College, but this is not a very well-known sort of national name brand college. Smith College, a student gave in, I'm not going to go into what Smith College is, this is not going to figure super prominently into this discussion. So for Smith, the student gave it an 8, but seemed to have quite a bit of reluctance. This is a single gender college. This is an all women's college. The student does already currently go to, a school that is likewise single gender. Seems like it wasn't really an ED contender for the most part. She also rated another school higher than this one, and since she wasn't willing to ED that, so I don't think this is a significant ED contender. She then has Amherst, which she also rated an 8. The problem with Amherst is it was lower in terms of the students' rating. It's not going to be that different in terms of competitiveness versus some of the schools that she rated higher. So basically, therefore, it has, the same or lower rating, meaning the same or lower upside as some of the other schools, but it has basically the same risk in terms of sort of a competitiveness standpoint, which doesn't make any sense to really factor this one in a lot. She then has Tulane. The dad didn't seem to like Tulane too much. The student said that she wasn't willing to ED to Tulane. She did rate it an 8.5. I'm not a big fan of Tulane. Over time, it rose a lot in the national rankings to sort of something in the top 40-ish range, and it's popular in some demographic regions and circles. It's vastly overrated, and it got slammed hard by the US News rankings a couple of years ago, mostly on account of, interestingly enough, diversity. So when they started factoring a lot more diversity metrics, Tulane fell like, 20, whatever it was, like a crazy number of spots in the US News rankings, like 30 spots, because like it's not as diverse of a school. For the top 3, which will be actually our focus. So the student rated these 3 all 9 or above. So one of them was 9, the other 2 were 10, and the parents or parent rated all of these a 10. So these are the three that we're going to focus on, and they are, as I already mentioned, Pomona, Brown, and Tufts. So the student does seem to really like schools that are like very liberal artsy types of schools, as we could sort of tell, by the Amherst, the Smith. She saw Pitzer, she saw Bonner. Like these are a lot of like very, and again, there are going to be a whole bunch of people listening to this podcast who are mainly interested in national research universities that are like, what are some of these schools? I've never heard of them before. Um, that are just not as popular. The actual liberal arts colleges, like Amherst, Smith, Pitzer, Barner, like some of these schools that don't have, they don't have law schools, they don't have medical schools, they don't have fully, they don't have Division I sports teams, they don't have major sports teams. Like the Michigan or even a school like a Stanford, a Duke, they have notable, sports teams that also, particularly in Michigan's case, obviously push the name brand recognition of the institution on top of many other factors, such as being a major research institution, having a ton of amazing graduate schools, law, medicine, etc. All that being said, we can definitely see some of her preferences here quite a bit in terms of the schools they went to go see, and then the ones that she rated high. And they definitely are much more like highly liberal arts, tend to be smaller schools. They skew very towards their strengths being social sciences and humanities, not as much like hardcore STEM or engineering. At the top here we have Pomona, we have Brown, and we have Tufts. So she gave Pomona Brown a 10, and then she gave Tufts a 9. Now Tufts was a self-guided tour, and she did sort of indicate that she maybe didn't get a full sense of it because she didn't do a formal tour. But that being said, she gave Tufts a 9, she gave Pomona and Brown a 10, and her parents rated all three of these a 10. So these are the three that we're going to be focusing on here for the analysis. So in terms of Brown, I would say it's definitely the one here that's going to be the most difficult for her to gain admission to. Now there are kind of categories here, right? You look at a student's profile and you're like, absolutely not. They're absolutely not getting into Brown, right? She's not in that category. She has all A's on her transcript so far, right? And we don't have ninth grade grades, unfortunately, but is what it is. Not a big deal. She has a quite rigorous course load, right? So she's around 10, sort of those college advanced courses that her high school offers, 10 or 11. So course rigors, generally on par. Her grades are on par. This is where it'd be great if you had like a class ranking, because I don't really know. It's just, how many kids at her high school have the same grades and GPA. Nobody knows because first of all, there's not even a grade distribution in the school profile. As I said, pretty much all private high schools do not rank students, but at least they'll give a distribution in their school profile of the grades, so you can get a sense of where the student lands. There's no ranking, right? Compare this to the prior student who was like number one out of 658 students, right? It's like you have just much more of a clear sense of what their GPA and grades mean at that high school, right? So that, being the case, she is still a straight A student, with a good chunk of course rigor, good relevant course rigor, a little bit of course liabilities that I pointed out, but there was nothing absolutely major. I wish we would have some AP exam scores that we don't, but that's not a major issue again for a kid who goes to a school that doesn't have an AP curriculum. The bigger issue with her profile, also her resume, her activities. There were no huge accolades. There were some. The Nisley semifinalist was nice. It's not an amazing award. The Youth Ambassador Algeria Middle East program, that's a good program. She had the researcher professor. So she definitely has a pretty solid. She also just happened to have a lot of relevant activities and awards, which is not the case for all students, particularly if they didn't have any help in this process from the earlier stages. It doesn't always sort of align in that way. And then we happen to find like very good positioning with the sociology that I think will, to the extent that some of her activities and awards were a little bit fragmented, like some of them were LGBTQ plus, some of them were more the race or ethnicity, some of them more the global. I think by picking the sociology filter, I think we found a much more compelling way to sort of tie a lot together and make them all relevant to each other. Right. So that will help as well. The activities could have been a little bit deeper, right? She could have had a little bit more impressive awards. You could sort of compare and contrast, I think, the sort of the quantity and the depth of activities and awards to the prior episode that we did. Student had a lot of very big, very well-known awards to top colleges. Scholastic Gold Key, Carnegie Hall soloist, which like wasn't even the main positioning. Just like as a by the way, Bank of America, student leadership program, like a lot of just like very well known, heavy hitting National Latin Exam gold, like just a lot of a lot of writing awards. Somebody sort of wondering, so what does a sort of more extensive resume or awards profile look like? I would refer to the prior episode. The student does have, I would say, compared to the other students, she has like some just activities that I like better, like the research with the professor writing the book, I think is a really cool project. I like this capstone project. I wish she had already done it, but I think it's really cool, really niche and relevant. She has some pretty cool activities that are relevant, that are niche. So her resume, including her activities and awards, it is definitely good. It's not like the best. It's not like you look at this for Brown and you'd be like, oh, this is a kid who's definitely getting into Brown, but it's in the vicinity for Brown, right? So she's not a student where we look at this profile and we say, oh, this is just no chance. People will say like, oh, you're too negative or you're too cynical or, you're fear mongering. Why don't you just go look up the acceptance rate at Brown and then just go see that, 96% of people who apply don't get in? It seems like most of the people who apply are overly optimistic by definition because 96% of them are wrong. There are a whole bunch of people who will apply to Brown and they have no chance in the world. Like that's not even a conjecture or me just trying to be hyperbolic or mean. It is a definitional statistical truth. Just look at the acceptance rate, and if 5% of the kids are getting in, 95% of the people who thought that they at least had a chance to get in, because why would you submit an application if you literally thought you had 0% chance of getting in? The acceptance rate's 5%, then by definition, 95% of people thought they at least had a chance of getting in and were wrong, right? So, a whole bunch of people do not have any chance of getting into a bunch of these top colleges, and they put in an application. It doesn't really matter a ton, if it doesn't interfere with you could have done ED to another school that you would have gone into and you wasted it, and then you don't get into any of the schools. It doesn't really matter if you're just talking about RD applications, if you're willing to do a whole bunch of applications. It is a time investment, so you do have to be careful there from a time allocation. If you're just adding application after application and getting up to 50 essays that you have to write, you do have to be careful about what you can handle. And a lot of students just can't write quality work for 50 different essays. But if you're just doing RD, there's not a major opportunity cost. So it doesn't matter a ton if you're somewhat delusional, with respect to your odds of getting to a school if it's just a regular decision school. That being said, this is not a student where we would say, oh, this is, she's definitely not going to get into any of these schools. She's definitely not implied for everything except for her SAT score. Now, the SAT score is a 1480. The ranges at Brown 1520 to 1570, so she's well below the 25th percentile of admitted students. And she can't not submit her score to Brown because Brown now requires the SAT and ACT as of last year. They brought it back, so she has to submit a test score to Brown. For Pomona, very small school. The SAT, the median score that they report is a 1540. Okay, 1540. So she's well below the median score, which is what you basically want to be at. The median, you want to be around the 50th percentile of the range. So if Brown's a 1520 to 1570, that's a 50-point spread. So it's like around a 1550. It's like the middle of the range, right? Same for Pomona. The median's going to be, hopefully around that 50th percentile range-ish, right? Is where you want to ideally be or higher. And so she's falling 60 points below that. Now, Pomona is test optional, as is this last school in the top three, which is Tufts, also test optional. And Tufts range is a 1480 to a 1560. So for only one out of the three, the one that I would say is the easiest to gain admission to, which is Tufts. It's only for Tufts that she's just at the 25th percentile. I believe she's signed up for August and September currently. And so she does have multiple more shots, but a lot of this candidacy analysis and the school analysis and the ED analysis will really hinge upon that final SAT score, because currently where she stands, she's only at the 25th percentile, which is basically not a submittable score for Tufts, and then clearly out of range for Pomona and Brown, right? So the SAT score is currently the biggest weakness of her profile. It's a little bit difficult to evaluate not knowing what her final SAT score is. And so I'm going to try to paint some contingencies here. This is what admissions is, um, which is a lot of decision making under uncertainty with like a lot of contingencies and like you don't know like if you're gonna how this activity is going to shape up over the next 3 years or whether you're going to win this award or whether this activity is going to go anywhere. There is a lot of decision making under uncertainty. So I do kind of like this to sort of model a little bit of some of this decision making under uncertainty because we don't have our test scores now. People could make this very less uncertain. And as I've said before in the podcast, if you start your SAT and ACT prep process when you ideally should, which for most pretty high flying, high academic achieving students should be about halfway or so through 10th grade, is when you should start your prep process for the SAT or ACT, ideally, maybe spring of 10th grade, certainly no later than by summer. Or very early fall 11th grade, you should be able to have a lot of test settings by the time you're in summer going into senior year. If you start it very late, you can see one of the big issues here. Like if you only have 2 test sittings under your belt because you're taking the SAT in spring of junior year, this is one of the really big problems because it's like hard to really prioritize the applications. What's the ED that's going to be due November 1st because you're still taking the SAT and that figures into what your ED is going to be. And then if you're still taking the test in the fall of senior year and then you got to submit your applications 2 months later, then there's a cutoff in terms of what scores they'll consider for early decision. So like this is also another reason to make sure that you are starting your test prep. Now there's the other side of people who are just like doing it way too early and they're like worried about ninth grade PSAT scores for like no reason and they're just worried about the wrong thing, right? Like they should be building their resume and focusing on their grades, but like they're worried about PSAT prep in ninth grade. They're just doing the wrong thing, right? That's the other end of the extreme, right? But most people should fall about in the middle there. Again, if you have a student who's taking rigorous course load, they're straight A students, like they should be prepared to start SAT, ACT prep by about halfway through 10th grade or so, certainly by spring and latest by summer. And then you don't run into usually as many issues. Now, you could start very early and just not be hitting the score that you need because it's obviously a very high score as we've seen by some of these score ranges. So you could also just end up have started very early and you're like on your 8th, 9th attempt of the exams. That's another situation, right? But try to not make it due to the fact that you started late would be my general words of caution to other people listening who are earlier in the process. Now, that will make it difficult, but I will kind of present like a gradient of risk scenarios here and outcomes. For Brown, she's in play for all of these schools, right? There's just going to be a spectrum of difficulty. Brown's going to be the hardest to get into, and I'll go into some more of the nuances. Pomona is a very close second. And again, for people who are much more national name brand research universities who are not as well acquainted with Pomona, it's very competitive. It also it's just a very, very small school. It's just a very small number of spots. It's not that different in terms of the competitiveness versus Brown. It's like probably right around the same ED rate in the last year or so. It's a very competitive applicant pool. So Pomona is basically going to be like like low to mid Ivy level difficulty school for people who sort of don't know Pomona as well, which is basically how I would define Brown. It's like a mid to lower level Ivy. I would put Brown as the most difficult for her, but not totally out of play, just a lot riskier. And the risk would really depend on also her SAT score and where she lands there in the grand scheme of things. The other thing that I will say to this student in particular and her dad and also to other students listening is I saw that she was currently signed up through the September exam. She should definitely be signed up for the October exam unless she already hit like a 1560 or something on the June exam and that I don't know about. She should 100% be signed up for the October exam. Like you shouldn't let that exam fill up because like sometimes you just can't get seats or whatever. She should 100% be signed up for the October exam because that score will still be considered even for ED1 schools, right? And you need the maximum number of attempts to give her the best chance because right now it's not looking great with what the SAT score is. It's the biggest issue with her candidacy with respect to these schools. So I would definitely sign up for October. That will be considered by the schools for early decision, that October SAT. Now, past that, it really depends on what happens, right? So it becomes a little bit more dicey. There's the November SAT, then there's the December. There's the December SAT. I'm just going to talk about the SAT for right now. So now with the SAT adding the September date, you have sittings August, September, October, November, and December. Now, if you end up, let's say you end up not getting into your ED1 school, which you won't know obviously in November because you won't have the decision back that comes back in the middle of December. But if you end up needing to do early decision two or regular decision, you're still alive, right? And so a lot of these colleges will still consider test scores all the way through the December settings, right? If you're talking about ED2, which is basically the same deadline as regular decision, which is January. We don't know what's going to happen in terms of what happens with her ED1. And so if you're going to play things really safe, which you should really be signed up for all of the SAT settings, right? This may sound a little crazy, but should really be signed up for all of the SAT settings for the rest of the entire fall and going into the early winter because it just doesn't make any sense, right? The only thing you're going to lose is maybe like a test fee in like the worst case. But if you don't sign up for them and you don't end up getting a seat because the test centers end up, filling up or something and you end up needing it, that's a really bad situation because the SAT score again is the weakest part of the profile here, right? So a lot of people can take the test a lot longer and more than a lot of people actually end up doing, right? So keep in mind if you're doing ED2 or regular decision or one of those deadlines like a January deadline, you know, and even Michigan has regular decision. The deadline is February 1st, which is that's like a major anomaly, but you can keep taking the test, right? And again, because you don't know what's going to happen with that ED decision until December, what's going to end up happening is there's going to be kids who are going to be like, oh, why would I take the November SAT or whatever? Like I already applied to my ED school. Yeah, well, what if you don't get in? Or if you don't get in, you won't know until the middle of December, then you missed the November SAT date and maybe you didn't hit your SAT score that you needed to by October, right? And then what you did was like you just let your foot off the gas pedal and then you don't get the ED1 decision. And then you could have taken the November and the December exam. And now you're like, oh, like, why did I think you had another two shots at it, right? So a lot of people should be thinking through these contingencies and these timelines a lot more. In this student's case, there's no reason to not be signed up for the October exam, right? Because that will be considered for all of the schools for all of the deadlines. At least if it has a November 1st ED deadline, which pretty much every school does, or early action or single choice early action, or she did almost all November 1st, right? There are some exceptions. There are some schools that are rolling. There are some schools that in the South have, October 15th deadlines, but we're not talking about any of those schools. So that's the first thing that I would say is like she should be signed up for every single exam through the rest of the fall and the early winter because like this is the biggest Achilles heel in her candidacy and certainly the October exam for sure. Now, getting back to some of the nuances between Brown, Pomona, and Tufts that will sort of, determine some of the difficulty or the shades of difficulty. So for Brown, it's the highest SAT score out of them, a little bit higher than Pomona, slightly higher than Pomona, but not really, almost kind of neck and neck. So we have the 1520 to 1570. So again, that's going to be harder for her SAT score versus Tufts, depending on where she lands, but certainly with where her current SAT score is. Second, in terms of the early admit rate, so this year for class of 2029, Brown's early admit rate was a bit of an anomaly. So it was 17.9%, and that was pretty high. So there's 907 students accepted out of 5,055. Now, I'm also going to give the early rate since 2021, 2022, because that sort of hedges against just, if it was just like an anomalous year, and this was an anomalous year in like potentially an overly optimistic direction because Brown's ED rate went up several points this past year, but you don't know how many students are going to be applying, what the rate, like you just don't know it for any given year. And so that is part of the measurement error or the sort of unpredictable variance. The best way we could predict it is from the past, but the past is obviously not a guarantee of the future, right? In terms of how many students will end up applying. Since 2021, 2022, the ED rate at Brown has been 14.97%, and that's including the most recent application cycle. So I wouldn't take the overly optimistic. If you're an overly optimistic person, and there are a ton of them out there, if you want to be the overly optimistic person, then let's just call it 20%. Heck, let's just call it 100%, right? But I tend not to skew towards over optimism because these are like very risky decisions being made here. I'm going to take the average over the past several years, and let's say that this is Brown's probably closer like 15% in sort of the middle, and there have been years where it's like sub 13, right? So if you want to be particularly cautious, you'll count on maybe Brown being one of the lower years, which was like around 13% in recent memory. If you want to sort of be in the middle, you'll call it 15. If you want to be very, optimistic, you'll look at the most recent year, which was an outlier in the optimistic direction. And if you're just the overly optimistic person who just burns to their EDs and ends up at their ninth choice school, then then you'll just think it's like a 50% chance because you just ED willy-nilly or don't even ED at all. Let's just do single choice early action Harvard. Why not? 17.9 over the past several years. I'd say 15's in the middle. There have been some low years that have been around 13. Now, here's the big issue with Brown, and I think I'm probably starting to call this to some people's attention in a way that they maybe haven't really thought about this much before. But in the last episode, I drew a lot of attention to the female versus male acceptance rate breakdowns and percentages. This has sort of entered some of the collective consciousness. There was a big New York Times article on this a few years ago, and I think Brown was probably one of the schools that was primarily mentioned. It is becoming increasingly more difficult. It depends on the institution, but for a lot of females to get admission to some of the top colleges, just because there's an imbalance in terms of female applicants and particularly high achieving female applicants. And this has been a progression over many years where it's skewed from a sort of male dominated college going population to a very female dominant college going population. And this is something that a lot of people do actually have to significantly take into account that maybe you haven't really thought about. So I mentioned in the last podcast with a student who we were talking about Yale. And Yale, I think it was 1 in 22 shot if you're a male and 1 in 30 shot overall if you're a female, right? And I talked about how that was related in all likelihood to the strength or the sort of emphasis of the institution. So you have more liberal arts, more social sciences, more humanities like Yale versus Stanford, which is more traditionally understood as more STEM, tech, engineering, computer science. You could sort of guess between Yale and Stanford which one. Now, Stanford's more difficult to get into overall, but when you accounted for the female aspect, Yale wasn't too far off, right? Because Yale is very social science humanities, tends to attract more of a female population versus much more STEM, hard sciences, engineering, computer science, which is much more Stanford. Now, Brown is the worst of the worst in terms of the Ivy League. So in terms of male versus female, it runs a spectrum. The most female-friendly, but male-unfriendly school in the Ivy League. Again, this isn't taking into account the overall difficulty of the institution, just the male versus female at that institution. So the most male-unfriendly and female-friendly, meaning the one at which females have the best relative chance to males at the institution, is Cornell. And again, Cornell, very STEM, very well known for engineering. That's the one that is the most female friendly and least male friendly in the Ivy League. On the total opposite end of the spectrum, the one that is the least female friendly, so most female unfriendly, right? And the most male friendly, i.e., if you're a female, you need to be very well aware of being a female applying to this institution, is a negative, unfortunately, from mission standpoints. And if you're a male, you have a much bigger bump at this institution, is Brown, right? So very male friendly, Brown, not female friendly. And then the converse, Cornell is the total opposite end of the spectrum. And again, Brown, very social science, very humanities. Of course, all liberal arts colleges are going to have STEM subjects, but Brown isn't known for being the best engineering school. It's known for a broad liberal arts education. It's got the open curriculum, and it skews more social sciences and more humanities. So we do have to take that into account. Now, at Brown, the female acceptance percentage overall, not early, we don't have those numbers. We don't know what it is early, but we have to assume that the early round is probably somewhat representative and looks pretty similar in terms of male versus female breakdown and acceptance percentage as the regular decision round. Overall, the female acceptance percentage at Brown is 4.38%, and for males, it's 6.99%. So overall, males have a 1 in 14 shot at Brown, and females have a 1 in 22, almost 1 in 23. So 1 in 14 versus 1 in 23 for a female. It's a very significant difference. It's just not a very female-friendly institution, unfortunately, because there's just way more. They basically balance just about 50-50 in terms of the incoming freshman class, but there are way more female applicants than there are male applicants at Brown. So we do have to strongly take that into account. In terms of students' high school, I would say they're likely to be, it seems like Brown's a pretty popular college. They're probably students knowing it's a private school. I'm sure there are probably some Brown legacies in her grade, though it's not a huge grade. It's not a very huge school to begin with. But there's likely to be more applicants. These are factors, they're considerations. I'm not saying this is definitively a reason not to, but these are the nuances that you should go through as you're sort of considering. And these are smaller nuances, though not that small with the female versus male. It's a very big statistical difference and advantage to males and disadvantage to females. But this is outside of just evaluating the student's resume and their test scores and the typical analysis that many people do. These are the nuances that do actually really matter in change admissions decisions, because this is how admissions actually works. It works based off of these factors and your overall scarcity based on many different dimensions besides just merit. Again, whether they need more of you, whatever more of you means, right? From the state, from this region, for this major, from that, this height, like you have all of this metadata, these tags attached to you, right? Um, so at her high school, it's probably, there are probably going to be more applicants. It's a pretty popular college. There might be some that are hooked. She, unfortunately, is not a legacy. So we obviously go through and assess whether the student's a legacy or not. She's not a legacy. At Brown, legacy is considered, and about 9% are legacy. So those are also spots that are obviously being taken up, and she does not have that advantage. Now, at a school that does not consider legacy, for example, Pomona, she's not losing any legacy spots at all to other students, right? So it's basically, it doesn't hurt her at all, right? So you do have to be aware of some of these nuances. You have to be aware of class size, how many actual effective spots are there available when you take out athletes and you take out Pell Grant recipients and you take out first generation students and you take out legacies and you're not any of these, right? This is the more precise analysis that actually allows you to predict these outcomes with a much higher degree of accuracy than most people do. And again, there's factors such as, major by ethnicity, right? Very overrepresented student. Stanford isn't dying for more Asian Indian kids instead. Like they don't have a scarcity of that. So you do have to understand the actual dynamics of admissions along these dimensions as well. Very high SAT score, ED rate around Pomona, though likely a little bit more probably competitive pool. Like it edges out Pomona. Some of these factors, the big disadvantage is going to be on the male versus female breakdown, given that she is a female. And then there are some bonus disadvantages, which is she's probably likely to run into some other fellow ED applicants coming from her high school, potentially students who have legacy, and just in general in the applicant pool, and particularly early, she's going to run up against other legacy students. She doesn't have any legacy, right? It doesn't mean to not do it. But again, when you have other potential issues in the profile, right? If you're not in the SAT score range, if the activity of the awards could be a little bit better, right? Like it then pushes it much more towards the higher risk category, right? In this case. So these are things to be aware of. Now, I will convey that we had a student in this past application cycle who applied to Brown. He was not the most impressive. He had a good profile. Like I would say he had a very high at a 35 ACT score. So there was no test score issue liability as there is in this student's case. But I would say he probably had a very comparable profile outside of the test score to the student. But he was a male and he was a legacy, right? And so those two extra sort of kind of call them like plus factors, right? Those two plus factors, on top of the fact that he also had a very viable, albeit very good ED2 school, and he was also very happy with a third choice school with an EA, he had a lot of backstops in terms of risk, and he had a lot of extra little asterisks or plus factors, knowing that Brown is much more male amenable, and he happened to have legacy as well. That gave us a lot more confidence to just do the ED to Brown, right? This student, on the other hand, is the opposite. She doesn't have legacy as he did. She is a female. This is not a very female-friendly institution, and she has some issues or some gaps in the profile. Now, she closes them, right, as she ends up with a 1580 on the SAT score. It might make things look a little different. Now, could she still have some more impressive awards? Maybe an extra activity or two could have been a little bit better. Yeah, right. Like I think she's still isn't like a clear admit for Brown. The SAT score would move her, you know, more into range. Still is going to be a little bit of an uphill battle. It's a very solid profile, the score notwithstanding, but it's not a standout. Like it's not a standout profile for Brown, and then without having any hooks and then also again being female. Pomona, it's not too far off from Brown, but I would put it as number 2 in terms of difficulty or risk of wasting an ED. Again, risk only comes into play if there's opportunity cost, right? Like it's blocking out something else. If you're doing regular decision, it doesn't matter. There's no risk. So for Pomona, SAT, I said median 1540, so basically about Brown, not really much of a difference there. Early admits 224 across 2 rounds. So Pomona has 81 and it has 82. Brown only has 81. So you have 81 and 82 across both rounds, 224 get in. Again, very small school and very small, number of admits here. The early admit rate, the last admit rate that we have, and also the number of admits. This is from fall 2024 incoming class, so class of 2028. We don't have the most recent data. The early admit rate, most recent one we have is 12.98%, and that is across both ED1 and ED2. If you want to find the ED admit rate for a school, you can go to the common data set. Sometimes it's in the most recent, sort of news articles, after the admission cycle or in December or March or April. But the final numbers posted in the common data set usually comes out later summer, early fall or so. So we don't have it for the most recent cycle. Most recent statistics usually just come from the announcements from the colleges if they choose to actually release them, which many colleges no longer do. But from the common data set, if you're looking for an ED rate for a past year, the past official rate, you can go down to the early decision column. You can look at the ED rate. You do have to check because schools that have early decision 2, you do have to be a little bit careful. The standard usually is that they will report the ED rate reported there will be both ED1 and ED2, but you do have to be careful to check it because a school could just report the ED1 rate, even though they have ED2. It's like there's no standardized protocol for this. What I did when I was checking this was I went and I looked at the Pomona website when you're always checking for different colleges. I looked at the Pomona website and they said like 220 kids or so were admitted across ED1 and ED2. And when you look in the common data set, it said about 220 or so were admitted. So I knew that it was both ED1 and ED2 that rate. But you have to be careful because there's just non-standardization of statistic reporting and you're making high stakes decisions off of this stuff, right? So you do have to be very careful. But that being said, across both ED1 and ED2, you have 12.98% for Pomona. Now, ED1 rates are typically quite a bit higher. So you could look at Pomona's ED rate and say it's 12.98%. That's basically Brown's lowest ED1 rate in the past several or ever historically, right? So you could say, oh, wow, Pomona is actually maybe even more difficult than Brown. The thing is that that's the 12.98% across ED1 and ED2. And ED1's is going to be usually quite a bit higher. So my guess is for Pomona, the ED1 rate's probably around like high teens in all likelihood, which means if you said, what was it for this last year for Pomona, it was probably around Brown's. And Brown had sort of an anomalously high year. So my guess is Brown's ED1 rate is still likely for this upcoming cycle, likely going to be lower than Pomona's. So I would still give Brown, it still has the edge in terms of being a little bit more difficult than Pomona, but it's not by a lot. Then for the early rate for Pomona since 2021, 2022, as I said, want to sort of see like was the most recent a little bit of an outlier. It's 13.23%. So 12.98 versus 13.23. Like it's been pretty consistent for several years around 13% across ED1 and ED2, with ED1 likely being probably higher teens, and then ED2 being probably closer to 10% or so. Then for the female acceptance percentage, it's not as bad or not as discrepant as it is as Brown, not nearly as bad as it is at Brown. So overall 6.7% for female, 7.59% for male. And so this is overall, males have a 1 in 13, females have a 1 in 15, 14.9. So like 1 in 13 versus 1 in 15, it's not as bad as 1 in 14 versus 1 in 23 at Brown. That matters a lot. You're talking about big differences when you're talking about Brown versus Pomona in terms of the male versus female breakdown here in terms of the admit statistics. Some other small nuances from our high school, very unlikely to have other ED applicants to Pomona. It's just, as we can tell, like there's only 1,700 kids applying to Pomona ED across the entire country, whereas to Brown there's 5,000. A lot of the ET pools are they could be 4,000, 5,000, 8,000. 1,700 is a very small ED pool. This school is also all the way across the country from our high school, so there's not going to be that like northeast bias versus a Brown. So like it's just very unlikely to run up against another kid who's applying ED to Pomona, which would be a benefit. Again, I'm not saying that it's a reason to 100% do it or not, but wouldn't you like to see the whole breakdown of the whole matrix sort of and see the whole picture and all the nuances? Probably. And then for Legacy is not considered at Pomona. It's been banned for quite a while. She will not be losing any spots to Legacies, and certainly none from her high school, as could be possible coming from a private school in the Northeast, applying to Brown. And then another factor that is a little bit slightly negative for Pomona is it does have a pretty high percentage of recent admits that are first-gen students and Pell Grant recipients, like it's 30% plus students. It's not a major factor or a major disadvantage, but it is higher than some of the other institutions that we're considering in terms of some lower SES first gen students that are being admitted, because she is not one of them. And then there are other factors like their athletes, for example, and other spots that get taken up. And so the precise analysis is you take all of the features of yourself and then you compare it to all the features of the admitted class, right? And so you take into account race, ethnicity. We don't have really precise geographic numbers that you have to really just, say, is the student more underrepresented state, more overrepresented state, etc. But, are they athlete, not an athlete? Are they a legacy? Are they not a legacy? Like, they Pell Grant recipient, not a Pell Grant? Are they a first gen? Are they not a first gen? Then you can actually get a lot closer and more precise with analyzing that particular student's odds of admission. Okay, finally, for the third school, Tufts. SAT range is the lowest among the three. Tufts is definitively the easiest to gain admission to out of the three. So it's kind of like Brown is like 1A, then Pomona is 1B. It's not too far below Brown. The biggest concern with Brown that makes it quite a bit harder than Pomona is that female acceptance situation. And then again, there's some other factors such as the legacy being considered. She's not a legacy at Brown, whereas it's not considered at Pomona. So that's really what creates more separation between Brown and Pomona, is some of those more nuanced factors. If you were just kind of looking at it overall, they're like kind of 1A and 1B, but there's actually probably some more separation, quite a bit more separation due to the nuances. For Tufts, it's quite a bit down in terms of the competitiveness, the risk of using an ED here. The risk basically just comes from the fact of you prefer the other schools a lot more than you prefer Tufts, but the risk is quite low in terms of from a getting in standpoint. Though, again, I will say that her SAT score is not good currently, even for Tufts, the least competitive of the three. All right, so right now her SAT score is only the 25th percentile for Tufts. So the range for Tufts again is 1480 to 1560, so it's the lowest out of the three. You don't know anything about the number of early admits or the early admit rate at Tufts or the early rate over multiple years, because they don't release any of these statistics and haven't for a very long time. I could say ballpark, it's very likely to be around 30%. For ED1, it's probably 25 to 30% acceptance rate based on comparable institutions of the same size. It's probably 25 to 30% for ED. And then for ED2, and I would probably say, to be conservative, 25% for ED1. And then for ED2, if I had to hazard a guess, I would probably say something like 15% acceptance rate, just to give a sense, but we don't actually 100% know. I'm just basing it off of a lot of other comparable institutions that we do have ED data for. And then female acceptance percentage, 11.6% overall, right? This is overall. So if we compare that It's 11.6 for Pomona. It was 6.7% for all students across all different decision plans. And then for Brown, it was 4.38%, right? So overall, just across all decision plans, not ED, you have a 1 in 23% chance as a female. You have a 1 in 15 chance across all rounds as a female at Pomona. And then the female acceptance percentage at Tufts is like almost 12%. So it's almost, like between 1 and 8, 1 and 9, right? So 11.6% versus 6.7 versus 4.38 for Brown, right? And so you can sort of see it's getting quite a bit easier as we go down. And so Tufts again is the least competitive here, and there's not a big disparity versus the male acceptance percentage, which is 11.4. So 11.6% for female, 11.4% for male. So not the same issue as we see at Brown. Also, in terms of her high school, there'll probably be some ED applicants. Again, these are just very small nuances. I'm not saying that, there are some kids who are like I found out somebody else is doing ED to Penn and they have legacy, and we don't really get caught up in that very much if we think the kid is a very strong candidate for Penn. I'm not really worried a ton about it, but like you should be aware, right? I think it would be stupid to say, if there's a high school that you go to and there's like 16 legacies in your grade to Penn and like they're all doing ED. The thing is, you can't rely on that. People make stuff up. You don't 100% know. So it's like very messy data, but it's not the worst thing to at least just be aware, right? I'm not saying you have to do anything with that information, right? So I'm sure there will probably be some kids doing ED to Tufts, not the same as for Pomona. And then Tufts does consider legacy. Again, she doesn't have legacy at any of these schools. It's not super high, but 6%. So all that being said, Brown is the most difficult, again, particularly because of the female acceptance percentage and the imbalance there. And then some of the nuances like legacy, she's not legacy. Pomona falls in the middle. I would say it's because of some of the nuances, Brown is definitely quite a bit more difficult for her particular case, being a non-legacy, being a female, than Pomona is. But Pomona falls in the middle, and then Tufts falls towards the bottom. In terms of the different ED scenarios, I'll kind of phrase it by some different risk tiers. So I'm going to paint a spectrum. I will give a opinion about, I don't know what her SAT score is, and that does cause a lot of issues here. I also don't know what her perspective is in terms of how she views the differences between the schools. I know she rated Brown a 10 and she rated Pomona a 10, but I don't know if, for example, because like kids do that all the time. They put two schools, both of them are 9, but like they actually have a very different feeling towards them in terms of ED decision making. So I don't know. All I know is on paper, Brown and Pomona are rated exactly the same by the student and her parents. I know Tufts was a slight notch down by the student. It was a 9 versus a 10. But I don't have the real extreme, qualitative feedback or her perspective on sort of the reward or the upside here in terms of these different schools. So I can't 100% advise there. Not obviously her advisor. I can't 100% advise on the risk versus reward here. And then we don't have the SAT score, which is probably the biggest problem because I just don't know where her SAT score is, and it's quite important for assessing her odds at these schools. So I'll give a spectrum of different risk tiers and scenarios. Some other factors that we don't know that could change things. We don't know how she's going to execute on the application. Hopefully this episode's helpful to her. I don't know how she's going to execute on the applications, the essays. That obviously can change things quite a bit. It's possible she gets an extra award or two. That would change things slightly, though there's not going to be some totally game-changing award that's going to come through between now and the application process. And then the last sort of moving piece here would be, trimester grades, right? There's some other variables, right? Brown has, a video interview, but I'll just consider that as part of the application execution. So there are all these factors that are still sort of pending or we don't 100% know yet. But the biggest and the most important contingency here is certainly the SAT score, which I don't know what the SAT score is going to be. And as she currently stands, she's only at the 25th percentile for the lowest of these 3 schools, which is Tufts. Okay, in terms of ED scenarios, risk tier 1, so I'm going to give 4 different scenarios based on ED and ED2. Risk tier 1 is the highest risk. Risk tier 4 is the lowest risk. The highest risk scenario is an ED to Brown. and an ED2 to Pomona, the two most difficult out of the three schools here. So it's the highest risk. I've mentioned the issues the Brown, the female not being a legacy, their test scores. Her profile is solid for Brown, but not standout, particularly without any of the extra hooks or oomph there. And certainly with the SAT score. Now, if the SAT score, if she gets up to a 1550, 1540, something that's in the mid-range for Brown, I'll go through some of these contingencies. Her profile obviously looks better, but I would say it's not like a no-brainer admit to Brown by any stretch. Again, she's still fighting a very uphill battle with the female percentages and breakdown, no other special hooks, but she's more in range for Brown. So I'll sort of go through those SAT contingencies. But this is the risk, yes, ED to Brown and then ED2 to Pomona. The problem is she is going to be more marginal for Brown. Even if she gets the SAT score up to 1540, it's still going to be a close call with the other factors. And the problem is she does ED to Brown. ED2 to Pomona is going to be like a 10%. So actually her ED to Pomona is going to be a lower percentage chance and a lower shot than actually her ED to Brown. So it's just not a lot of protection, right? I think some people think that like that ED2 is like really serving like a really great backstop, but like you're dealing with like a 10% ED2 acceptance rate to Pomona. Like it's just you can't fall back on that. And the other thing we have to look at is, okay, well then what happens after that, right? And so if you're a student, and this is obviously the risk, reward, the dynamics, all this changes on a case-by-case basis, depending on the student's candidacy. Do they have an ED2? Do they have 6 schools that they love that are like, viable? But the thing is like she doesn't have a lot of schools on her list that she liked very much outside of these 3 schools. And so if she does ED to Brown and she misses, and then she doesn't get in ED2 to Pomona, both of which are quite possible. She's now regular decision at Tufts, right? Can't count on that to come through. That's like a 10% chance overall. Or actually, it's going to be quite a bit lower. The overall is 11%, but the ED1 and ED2 is obviously dragging it up quite a bit. And so ED1 and ED2 is going to fill like 60% of the class at Tufts, right? So you're probably I don't know what the RD rate is off the top of my head, but who knows what it is, maybe 7%, 8%, something. It's going to be lower. But that's what your RD rate is at Tufts. You can't count on Tufts coming through. And so you're not into Brown, you're on to Malone, you're on to Tufts. And then, it didn't seem like, now she might be okay with Tulane. She might be okay with Smith. She might be okay with some of these other schools. You can't count on Amherst coming through for sure. It's one of the most competitive liberal arts colleges, and she's in the regular decision rounds. You're also single digit acceptance, right? Right. So, if she had 7 schools that she loved, you could say, there's 2 if we miss on those EDs, then there's like 5 in the regular decision rounds. It's still not, the thing is people fall back on quantity too much. Like they just think that because there's 5 in the but they're all very improbable to come through in the regular decision round, right? And then what happens is you get all this post hoc rationalization because there are people who got into some school regular decision. You have to be very careful here. She doesn't have a lot of schools that it seems she's super happy with as backstops. You just can't rely on any schools to come through any top colleges in the regular decision round. It doesn't mean that nobody gets in. Obviously, people get in the regular decision round. It's just statistically you can't count on it, right? If the regular decision acceptance rate is 7% or 5%, it's like do you think statistically you can count on that? No. Right. And so people always come up with all this like availability bias, like, well, I know this person who got in regular, or I know, or, my family, or whatever. That is availability bias. That is just the information that's in front of your eyes. Right. We know what the overall statistical probability is. Right. And so I told this to a family recently, like if you had a friend who got struck by lightning, you're going to think you have a higher probability of getting struck by lightning than is actually the case because it's availability bias. It's right in front of your eyes, right? You have a friend who got struck by lightning. And there might be some rational or logical reason why you might have a higher chance of being struck for lightning. Like you might be in locations that I don't have a higher probability and your friend is in the same location. So there could actually be some logical reasoning there. There is just an overall general probability of being struck by lightning. And even though you have a friend who got struck by lightning, it's just extremely unlikely you're going to get struck by lightning. But because you have a friend who got struck by lightning, it's right in front of your eyes, right? And then you also are dealing with confirmation bias and optimism bias and all the stuff. You have to sort of weigh things and just be careful. We know what the regular decision percentages are, and they're very low. right? And there's a lot of reasons why it's very unideal to be in the regular decision round, as I've laid out. She doesn't seem to have a lot of schools that she really particularly loves if she slips past the ED rounds, and so you have to take that into account. If she does ED to Brown and she does ED2 to Pomona, there is a high likelihood that she doesn't get into either of them, I will say, right? And again, the Pomona doesn't add a lot of hedging or backstopping because it's probably harder than the Brown. It's probably about the same as the Brown. ED, again, we have that female sort of issue there and the legacy issue, but that ED2 rate, at least on its surface at Pomona, is going to be lower than Brown's ED rate. Risk tier 2, if she does Brown ED, and then she does the less risky ED2, which is Tufts, right? That's risk tier 2. If you ask me what happens in risk tier 1, in all likelihood, again, this sort of depends. I don't know what her SAT score is going to be, so this will change things. I would say if she goes with risk tier 1, her most probable outcome is she gets into neither Brown or Pomona, based on what I currently know, and not knowing that she has, for example, a 1570, right, on the SAT. Just like assuming the probability is like maybe she improves a little bit on the SAT, but doesn't quite get into the Brown Pomona range. I'm going to just sort of say like, including the contingencies here with her SAT, where it is, maybe she improves a little bit, but like it's not highly probable she gets to the Brown Pomona range of like 1540 plus. I'm gonna say that it's likely she would end up missing on both Brown and Pomona. Risk tier 2 for Brown and Tufts, I'm gonna say again, including all the contingencies with the SAT score, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to say in that situation, she ends up getting into Tufts ED2. So you could make a case, you go for Brown. I think she will have a pretty good chance of getting into ED2 at Tufts, but I will say that I would like her SAT score to get into Tufts. It should still ideally get closer to the middle of Tufts range, which is like 1520. If she stays at a 1480, she basically needs to be test optional because it's just if you're 25th percentile or lower, you're just generally advised to be test optional, which is okay at Tufts. You can do that at Brown. You can hide the test score, but it's just like not great not having that piece of information. She has no other AP scores. She goes to a private school where it's just more expected that the students do well in standardized testing. It's just not great even if she went test optional. So I would say really she still has to get to like a 1520. And then I would say like she would get into Tufts, ED2 in that risk tier 2 situation. I would say she has a good shot. It's not a foolproof, but I would say the ED2 odds overall are probably about 15%. For a general student, I would say she probably has about like a 50% chance of getting in if she gets her SAT score to a 15, 20 or higher. I would say she probably has about a 50% chance of getting in ED2 to Tufts. For risk tier 3, we have ED to Pomona and ED2 to Tufts. This is the plan that I like the best, which is it's not the absolute most risky with the Brown, not knowing also where her SAT score currently is, being on the absolute low end for Tufts, and not even close to the Brown or the Pomona range currently where we stand. I do like this currently with what we currently know the best, which is ED to Pomona, ED2 to Tufts. And then risk tier 4 is ED to Tufts. This is the safest route, and ED2 to Pomona. Now, the problem with this is the ED2 to Pomona would be way harder than the ED to Tufts, right? And so it's weird, right? It's like you're using your hedging of risk with something that's even riskier, right? And some people do this. And so the analogy I like to use is if you were trying to bench press, like 225 and you failed, and then you go and put in like a couple of extra 45s, and now you're trying to bench 315, like it doesn't make any sense, right? That's kind of like what having a harder ED2 is to get into, because the ED2 rate's always going to go down versus the ED at that school. And then sometimes people also then apply to a harder school. So it's like you have compounding levels of difficulty. So that's what's happening here. Pomona is more difficult to get into, and then also you get the ED2 drop, right? So you kind of get compounding. So it's not really a big hedge. Now, my barbell analogy isn't perfect because there are institutional differences, right? So Tufts has different institutional priorities. There could be different composition of the applicant pool. So there are differences. There are reasons why a student, again, I've said this before, why a student would get rejected or turned away by an quote unquote easier institution or an easier round, and then get into maybe a seemingly more difficult school or in a more seemingly, difficult round, such as ED2 versus ED. And it has to do with the composition of the applicant pool, what the school needs based on what it already, accepted, or, the applicants, right? So, if you just happen to be putting pressure on something that the school needs a little bit more, that's where you do get these sort of outcomes that seem like they're just sort of unexplainable variants. They're not unexplainable. They can be a bit unpredictable because you don't know exactly what the composition is of the applicant pool. It would still be to her benefit to have the additional ED because she has no other EDs. Brown doesn't have ED2, and then she doesn't really have any other schools that I think are, good enough or that she likes enough to put in that ED2 slot. So it just doesn't matter, right? Because it's just like, yeah, the Pomona is not going to really help her a bunch if she doesn't get into Tufts out of that ED2, but she doesn't have another ED2 anyway, so you're kind of comparing against no ED2. That's sort of the logic there. It's weird in that the ED2 to Pomona is going to be a lot harder than the ED to Tufts, so it's not really like a significant risk backstop that she doesn't get into Tufts, but it's better to have the additional ED2 in this case than to not, because like it's probably her number one or number two school, Pomona, and so why not take the additional ED shot? Like, it doesn't cost anything at that point because there's no other ED2 option. Again, just to recap these, riskiest, ED to Brown, ED2 to Pomona. Next most risky, ED to Brown, ED2 to Tufts. The third tier, ED to Pomona, ED2 to Tufts. And then you have the lowest risk, ED to Tufts, and then ED2 to Pomona. If she can improve her score and get it at least closer to 1520, she's almost like, I would say she will almost, unless there's just like she totally like messes up the applications or, like just something that I can't really predict, she should get in ED to Tufts without much of a problem. Even if she went test optional with the 1480, I think she would still have a pretty good shot. I just don't like it, again, particularly because of the context, the private school. Like, it's just more expected for kids who come from more upper SES demographics, and private schools, they're expected to have the tutoring, take the test a bunch of times, etc. I don't love it, but she still would probably have quite a good chance of getting ED to Tufts, even in that case, even if she were test optional for ED. So there's a spectrum here. I think not knowing what her ultimate SAT score is going to be, I kind of like risk tier 3 the best with like the ED to Pomona and the ED2 to Tufts for like all the kind of contingencies involved here. I will say that if she ends up in the 1480 to 1520 on the SAT, like somewhere in that range, I think she needs to be on the lower end of the risk spectrum, like more risk tier 4. I think if she gets up to a 1530 plus on the SAT, I think she's more like that risk tier 3, which is the Pomona ED and then ED2 to Tufts. I think she should only consider risk tier 1 and 2, which is the Brown ED, and then either Pomona or Tufts ED2. That should only be considered if she gets up to a 1530 plus at minimum, and ideally a 1550 plus. She should not consider Brown. She will not be able to go test optional at Brown. And again, both those situations involve her applying to Brown, unless she gets to a 1530 plus, which is getting pretty close to the mid-range for Brown and also Pomona. Unless she gets to a 1530 plus, and ideally 1550 plus, I wouldn't even really consider the Brown ED options, which are, again, risk tier 1 and risk tier 2, right? Now, should you do the ED to Brown and Pomona, or ED to Brown and ED2 to Tufts? If she gets up to 1550, again, I would like the SAT score to be as high as possible. If she would be doing ED to Brown, I would have a preference just for her case. And again, knowing the female dynamics, knowing not hooked, knowing high school probably going to have some EDs to Brown, knowing that her profile, her resume is solid, but it's not the best. If she gets like 1550 plus, I would prefer the Brown ED and then the Tufts ED2. That would definitely be a preference. She's definitely in range if she gets her SAT score up for Brown, but like a rejection just with her profile and some of the other dynamics that I mentioned, it wouldn't be very surprising at Brown, even with the SAT score being, up pretty high. So that's kind of more of my commentary and sort of talking through here. Again, there's other contingencies. Like I said, there's the SAT contingency, which we don't know yet, and that does cause a lot more uncertainty in this case. And then the other contingency as well is like I don't 100% know her feeling on Brown versus Pomona versus Tufts 100%. If a student were like, I rated Tufts 1,000,000, but I actually like absolutely hate Tufts, or like I just wouldn't really want to do any ED to Tufts, then like a lot of these other things sort of change the variables. Other variables that can change things again is just like how many other schools do you have behind these EDs? But again, the problem is, and it would be much better if they're EA schools, like if nobody else can put in EDs. But, if you're looking at a school like Tufts, for example, and you don't do ED to it, well, then there are kids who did ED, then there are kids who did ED too, and then the class is 60% full, and you're in the regular decision round, right? And even if it's not ED1, ED2, it's just Brown, it's like, for whatever it's going to be, right? It's like 3% acceptance rate, in the regular decision round, 4%. To some extent, it doesn't really matter. Like, it matters some of how many backstops you have that are regular decision or early action schools, but like you are dealing with a lot of other pretty, low probabilities as well. And you're just dealing with the fact they don't know if you're coming. You can get yielded. There's way more students applying. You don't know what all of the institutional priorities are. The applicants who put pressure on different priorities filled up that major, et cetera, et cetera. So you're definitely rolling the dice. Those are also other nuances that come into play as well. So this is kind of me just talking through, presenting different scenarios. There are some kids that they're just not competitive at all, and somebody needs to tell them they're not competitive, unfortunately, because like they will just literally waste something when they could have used it in a more wise fashion. That's at least useful here to say like it's not that she's not competitive for Brown at all, setting aside the SAT score currently. I sort of presented all the nuances, the risk, the different tiers, the decision making, some of the contingencies with the SAT, some other factors we don't know yet, like our application execution. So it's a little bit more of a commentary and not me saying very specifically to do X or Y, but just sort of, giving the lay of the land and the analysis here. So hopefully that was helpful for the students, her dad, her parents, as they sort of go into the application process. Hopefully this is helpful for a lot of other people listening who are in the application process now, thinking about how to frame their own hooks. Some of these case studies, I hope they're helpful. And also for students who are in this sort of bind in this decision-making mode over different EDs or, ED1, ED2, etc., and choosing their early schools, even if they don't have ED, etc. Hopefully a lot of this was helpful to think through some of the nuances in terms of the school analysis, the female, male. We've gone into a lot of nuances in terms of admit rates, ED1 versus ED2. Last podcast also, ethnicity considerations, positioning considerations at different schools based on their strengths, etc. So I hope this has been helpful to everyone who is going through the application process, the students, and we will talk soon in the next episode. Bye-bye.